Okay, so good evening, good afternoon, and good morning to all of you who have joined today from different time zones and from different parts of the world. This is the third webinar of the webinar series organized by Aquadam on reimagining groundwater governance with special emphasis on India. So I will just share my presentation. Yeah. So I'm Uma Aslekar and I'm working for Aquadam and I will be moderating today's session along with my colleagues Rucha, Mukesh and Kunal. So last week we had an interesting discussion on the topic understanding groundwater governance through transdisciplinary sciences. The theme of today's workshop or webinar is making groundwater governance inclusive, embedding key narratives. And to discuss this theme, we have invited four eminent speakers and four panelists who will be sharing their views and ideas on this particular topic. Like last week, we have 10 minutes allotted to each of the speaker and panelists to express their views and ideas. And we have around 20 minutes discussion after the first session, that is after the presentation, and 20 minutes discussion towards the end of this session. So we have around 40 minutes we have reserved only for discussion. So I will request all the participants to post their questions in the Q&A section, and we will try to take as many questions as possible during the course of this webinar. So before I invite the first speaker to share her views, I would like to present a couple of slides just to set the context for today's theme. So we all know that groundwater governance provides a framework of guiding principles for management of groundwater and the use of aquifers. And while we design these principles, it is presumed that they are inclusive. So by inclusive means aiming to provide equal access to opportunities and resources for people. Now, as groundwater is linked to lives and livelihoods, it is very, very critical that this whole process is pretty inclusive. Now, groundwater is a common pool resource and it is a natural resource. And like any other natural resource, there are some challenges in making it inclusive. These challenges are posed by some of the natural reasons and some are due to the man-made reasons. With groundwater, the first challenge is about the aquifer diversity and aquifer heterogeneity. Now, as you can see in this map of India over here, you can see that there are different colors. So these are the different hydrogeological formations or hydrogeological typologies. So the brown color is the mountainous aquifer systems. Then we have alluvial systems. Then we have sedimentaries. We have hard rocks like basalt and crystalline basement systems. And all these systems bring a lot of diversity. So the aquifers show different characteristics with respect to the storage capacity as well as the transmissivity of the transmissivity. And that's why while we look at the regional scale, it is pretty challenging when we want to frame a policy at that pan India level. At the same time, if you look at the local scale, for example, a scale of an village or a watershed, there are some challenges due to heterogeneity in the aquifers. So there are all of you have seen or must have read that in a watershed or in a village, there are some wells which are perennial. Although they might not yield more water, but they have water throughout the year. At the same time, there are some areas where the wells have good water, but they dry up after the winter season or what we call as Rabi season. And there is hardly any water left in the aquifer during the summer months. So within aquifer also, because of this heterogeneity, there are challenges even while we manage the groundwater at the local level. Along with that, there are some challenges in making groundwater governance inclusive. And quickly, I'm going to pose these challenges. The first challenge that I feel that it is we need to address is the issue of scale. We all know that we have worked at the river basin scale and we know the issues related to upstream and downstream areas. But while we work on groundwater management or governance, the issues are different. There are some areas which are the recharge area for the aquifers, and there are some areas which are called as discharge area, where the groundwater naturally comes out or naturally gets discharged. Now it is observed that especially in the peninsular India, the recharge areas are areas where the soil covers are thin. It is the soils are pretty poor. They are owned by the low and marginal farmers, and most of the recharge interventions are implemented in this particular region. So there are different measures like check dams are constructed, some contour trenches, and all those watershed interventions are constructed for the recharge activities in that particular region. Now, this is the region where all the hard work is done, and the results or the fruits are by the farmers or the community members who are residing in the discharge area. This is a natural system, but while we frame any policy, we need to take into consideration this issue. The second issue is with the what we call as temporal scale. As you can see in this map of India, this is the map representing different blocks. So there are some blocks are marked as red and yellow, and some are colorless, or what you can see is white. So these red and yellow blocks are the blocks which are identified as groundwater overexploited, or blocks which are critical, which are in the critical stage. This is the map which I have taken after the Central Groundwater Board's data. And the white or colorless blocks indicate that the groundwater is so-called safe, which means that here the recharge is more than what the abstraction rates are. So this is the regional scale, what happens at the regional scale. And this is, as of now, this is the situation in India. But when we look at the local scale, again, there is one needs to take into consideration the development that has happened over the period. This is one example from a village from central Maharashtra, what we call as Marathwada region. And in this region, you can see that there are at present there are more than 1,000 borewells and 500 dugwells. The first borewell was drilled sometime in the late 80s and early 90s, and the almost 85% of borewells were drilled between early 2000 and 2015. So within the span of 15 years, more than 85%, which comes to around 600 to 700 borewells, were drilled in this village. So while we frame some kind of governance mechanism for such areas, or if when we do some projections or when we do some modeling, this kind of development mechanism has to be taken into consideration. The third point I feel is important is about the land ownership. It's a well-known fact for India that 78% of 78% small and marginal farmers in India own less than 2 hectares of land. And all these farmers together, they have access to almost 40% of wells and borewells. So these are the small and marginal farmers use almost 40% of the groundwater. And whenever we have any discussion or discourse on groundwater governance and management, these people are seldom included. And this also is a crucial point that I want to bring onto the table. Same is the case when you look at the locals at the village scale. And again, one can clearly see that the small and marginal farmer in this particular representative village in Maharashtra, almost 68%, more than 65% of these farmers are the small and marginal farmers. And this is the case throughout in most part of the India. Then the fourth point that I feel is very crucial is the gender. Women are seldom included in these kind of discussions. And although they form 50% of, they are 50% members of our societies, they are never or rarely included in any kind of discussion on groundwater governance and management, with some exceptions. There are states, especially in the Northeast or in states like Kerala, women have some say, but otherwise in most of the states in India, they rarely have a say. Then there are some other challenges like climate change. We all are familiar with this challenge, and because of this climate change and variability, in the last couple of years, we all are witnessing that. And just to bring a perspective to that, I would like to share this map for India, where we have used data from Indian Meteorological Department for the rainfall for last 100 years. Now here you can see that there are some districts which are shown in blue color, and there are some districts which are shown in pink color. So the districts that are showing blue color are the districts where there is an increase in the rainfall in the last 100 years. And the pink districts are the districts where there is a decrease in the rainfall over the last 100 years. Now, one can clearly see a relationship here, because all these parts, so basically Eastern India and the Northeastern India, and along with the states like Kerala, where you have more than 1500 millimeters of rainfall, this is the assured rainfall zone. And in this part, if there is a decrease in the rainfall by 15%, it means a lot. And again, while we frame our policies for the future, these challenges needs to be taken into consideration. And lastly, there are some externalities like government policies. Government frames some certain policies for the betterment of the society on the large, mostly. But what happens is some government policies like the irrigation or agricultural policy or energy policy may prove to be detrimental for the resource like groundwater, because in some way or the other, it has an adverse effect on the abstraction, and then this leads to overexploitation of the aquifers, and eventually the groundwater gets depleted. So these were the few challenges that came to my mind when we talk about inclusiveness. And that's why towards the end, if we want to discuss this theme today, that how to make groundwater governance inclusive, I would like to pose a question to all you eminent speakers and panelists, that how can we bring equity, fairness, and justice in groundwater governance? And with this brief background, I would like to invite our first speaker, Ms. Seema Kulkarni. Ms. Seema is the senior fellow working with Society for Promoting Participative Ecosystem Management, known as SOPECOM in Pune. And she will be she'll be speaking on the theme engendering groundwater governance. So over to you, Seema.
Yes. Thank you, Uma, and thank you, Aquadam, for inviting me for this webinar. And it's a privilege, of course. I would be sharing a PowerPoint presentation. So Rucha, maybe you could start sharing in the interest of time we get going. But first of all, of course, good evening, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are. And hope to have an enriching discussion today on issues of inclusion in groundwater governance. So Rucha, can I request you to?
Yes, ma'am. It's on.
Yeah. So we are, yeah. So I think, I mean, just as we hope to make, you know, the invisible resource, groundwater, visible to inform policy and practice, here's an effort to actually help understand the invisibility of the gender question in groundwater governance. We'll start with a very short video of a woman farmer and the issues that she narrates in this video. So the first slide, Rucha.
Rucha, it's not audible. I mean,
yeah.
Video is...
I think you need to check the sound.
Just give me a moment. We are resharing it.
Sorry, Rucha, it's still not audible.
Maybe you could just play the video, Rucha, and not play it from the PPT. That might help. or I could try to, let me see.
Just
No,
give.
it's still not audible.
Okay. No, I think we can just, yeah, you can just begin with the presentation maybe. I think what the video showed, she's a woman farmer from a farm suicide affected household. And she's narrating a story of how she navigates the multiple struggles she faces as a farmer to hire labor, to try and access water, access credit and markets. So for her, the question is not really just about water, but also her farm, her inputs that are required, and also issues of sexual harassment, sustenance of her children and her family, and really many, many more things that constitute her world. And there are a number of stories that we have of women who are engaged as tenant farmers, as commuter farmers, who travel. Commuter farmers are those who are traveling from their
4
marital
एकर
homes.
शेती
Okay.
पिकं तूर, कापूस आणि सोयाबीन असं घेते मी पीक वर्षाचं. हां. घरात माणूसच नाही कोण. मी आणि माझ्या 2 मुलीच आहेत आणि माझे मालक वारले तेव्हा 6 महिन्याची मुलगी होती लहानी. 15 वर्ष झाले माझे मालक वारलेले. आता काही नसल्यामुळं घरात सगळी अडचण, सगळा प्रॉब्लेमच. घरात माणूस असेल तर सगळ्या प्रश्न सुटतात ना. एकटीच्या बाई माणसाच्यानं काहीच प्रॉब्लेम सुटत नाहीत. आता शेती करायची म्हणल्यावर त्यासाठी बी भरायला लागते पेरायला, तर पैशाची अडचणच आहे ना. मग त्यासाठी लोकांच्या शेतात जायचं, 4-8 दिवस काम करायचं, परत ते पैसे घ्यायचे, त्यापासून खत आणायचं, बी आणायचं, नंतर ते पेरायचं. मग त्यातून एक 6 महिन्याचं उत्पन्न असतंय ते. मग परत त्यातून ते फवारायचं, त्यासाठी अडचण पैशाची. मग त्यासाठी आणखीन परत काम करायचं लोकांचं. मग परत त्याचे पैसे घ्यायचे, परत त्याचं औषध आणायचं, बाहेरचा गडी लावायचा, ते फवारायचं, स्वतः पाणी द्यायचं, काय वेळेस स्वतः पण फवारायचं. बाहेर गेलं तर कोण टायमाला येत नाही. मग त्यामुळं अडचण येतेच ना. मग असं वाटतं की ती नाही केलेली बरी शेती, असं काय वेळेस होतं ना. त्याच्यामुळं कोणाकडे गेलं तर त्यांना म्हणायचं नाही 4 दिवस थांबा, 8 दिवस थांबा, नंतर येतो. अशा अडचणी भरपूर आहेत ना. मग आपण 4 दिवस थांबलं तर शेतातली ओल उठून गेली तर परत येत नाही. अशा भरपूर अडचणी येतात. काही वेळेस टायमाला पैसे नसते, तर मग पैसे नसल्यावर कोणी येत नाही. पैसे दिलं तरच येते. अशा काही अडचणी असतात. त्यामुळे भरपूर अडचणी येतात. मुलीच आहेत 2 मला. बी आता पाऊस पडला एवढा, त्यातून सोयाबीन सगळं गेले, सगळं नुकसान आहे. आता काहीच नाही, एवढा खर्च केलाय.
Yes. So, as I was saying, I mean, this is a story of, this woman, but several such stories that we have, where we've seen women who are navigating at multiple levels. And for her as a farmer, I think her world is much beyond what we understand as, the agrarian distress or the water crisis, but it encompasses, her entire life. So what are the key issues that are emerging from stories like Rani or Ranjana, the numerous women farmers that we are working with? And here we've seen that just to ensure water security, women are mortgaging their land, they're pawning gold, forced to sell other assets, including livestock, which very often happens to be their only wealth in a way. So to ensure water security, we've had stories of women who are not able to adorn a single piece of jewelry, which is permanently with the money lender. They're also borrowing at multiple, events in a year. They are borrowing from multiple sources just so that they can service the older loans. Then there are also, numerous social dimensions which rarely gets a mention in the water governance story. So there are daughters of marginal farmers from irrigated areas not finding suitable match in irrigated areas, so need to be married off into drought-prone areas, or sons from drought-prone areas not finding a match at all. Uh, and there is loss of childhood, education, girl children losing out, and many, many more of the social dimension that really the water governance misses out on. We also have stories of women who are leasing in land and purchasing water, who've had to face several experiences where they faced either denial or delays in accessing various resources. So water is among them, especially if they are single, in hiring of labor, access to markets, credit, and all of this access to resources, which is governed by power relations based on caste, gender, marital status, and several other forms of discrimination. We've also been noticing that there has been a substantial increase in unpaid labor, expenditure saving labor, as has very well brought out by studies by Ashwini Deshpande and Naila Kabir, where they are showing that there is an increase in expenditure saving labor. In Maharashtra, the Western Indian state, we also see that what was traditionally a practice, which is exchanging labor, is very much on the increase. So all of these stories, in a way, do tell us that water and the agrarian crisis is a gendered one. It means that women have had to mobilize their unpaid labor, exchange labor for expenditure savings, let go of their meager savings, gold, animal wealth, just so that subsistence becomes possible. So we look at the features of contemporary water governance, and I'm going to just show you a few pictures so we can move to the next slide. So these are also stories that, in a way, narrate the development model that is being pursued. The marketized, commoditized agrarian model, which is heavily subsidized by subsistence farming, of which, of course, women bear an undue burden. It's a very interesting the way Mariam Mies explains in her iceberg model, where she shows how capital and waged labor are at the tip of the iceberg, while nature and the large non-wage work done by women and marginalized communities are in fact submerged. So the green revolution, or the current agrarian model, and more generally the developmental model, is based on continuous extraction of natural resources, replacing diversity with monocultures, heavy state subsidies on chemical fertilizers and pesticides. So all of this, instead of investing in commons, building soil health and human health, focusing in fact on rain-fed areas and marginalized communities, we see a trend of what the green revolution kind of a model that is increasingly being proposed. So this is as if to underscore, in a way, the inevitability and rather the desirability of an industrial urban transition, which also, in a way, means emphasizing more in the context of water on more revenue per drop of water, or more crop per drop of water, and a transition to water for agricultural commodities or water for industrial use over livelihoods and the environment. So what we see in the contemporary water governance is essentially transitions from what we've seen in the first phase of supply to demand management, where infrastructure and technocentric solutions were, in a way, replaced by measures of pricing, decentralized management. But both these phases can essentially be characterized as gender neutral and largely followed the principles of capital and markets. And what we see today is depletion of water tables and a decline in the quality of water, and the inequities in access continue with really long-term impacts on health of the ecosystem as well as people. If we move to the next slide, this is what we know already, so I won't repeat too much, but I think what we already know is that, again, through pictures, Rucha, you could move to the next slide, is that women are engaged in water collection and utilization in the domestic sphere, but they're also engaged in irrigated and rain-fed agriculture, increasingly providing the labor that does not pay them. In fact, all of nationally representative data show that women's participation in labor force is declining, while their engagement in subsistence activities and expenditure saving activities is increasing. The recent time use study also shows how women's time in water collection has not declined despite the numerous flagship programs. Studies also show that when a drought occurs, it is in fact the women's work days that fall by 11% or more than men's. And women are, of course, less likely to migrate, so their opportunities for work also are limited. During drought and overall during a water crisis, what we see, which is in fact now, as we know, it's much more of a norm than an exception, that women are called upon or compelled to mobilize their free labor, as is the case during any other crisis, such as labor shortages and the agrarian distress. So in a way, the story of women's participation also reflects a very similar picture. And in the decision-making spaces in the water sector, from the micro to the macro, is really very dismal, to say the least. So we've seen a lot of shifts in policy in terms of bringing women on committees at the local level. But while they are on these committees, their knowledge really does not find any space in the present framing of the water problem. At the meso and macro level, studies that have been done by Saki Waters and Sopicom have shown the pervasive nature of the glass ceiling effect. Women barely reach the top decision-making positions in water. So division of labor and undue responsibility with no commensurate gains is largely the story that we see. So to just conclude this point on contemporary water governance practices, we see that this really promotes a certain kind of an economistic approach, which has failed in achieving sustainability goals, but has also completely invisibilized women. It has, in a way, missed on addressing the power relations that govern and maintain various forms of discrimination in society. So it has failed women and the marginalized communities in understanding and addressing the differential access to assets that are linked to water, differential uses, requirements, the value of their knowledge, and of course, the decision-making spaces, the gaps that we have already seen. So finally, how does this understanding take us any further? So if we move to the next slide, Rucha. I think all of this, the stories, we can move to the next one, clearly show that the water and the ecological crisis, we can move on, Rucha. We can move on. Yeah. This is actually some images from studies that we have done at Sopicom, which show the inequities in access to resources across caste, gender, and clearly, the point that I was trying to make, how gender, caste, patriarchy, and other forms of discrimination clearly are limiting and are certainly not part of the water governance agenda. So moving on to the next slide and to the final point that I want to make, in terms of how all of this understanding, where does it take us and what really are our suggestions for the future? So I think it's very clear from the number of examples that I have cited and which is already documented densely, we know that water and ecological crisis is a gendered crisis and certainly needs immediate attention. And we certainly have a long wish list, which has also been presented to the National Water Policy Committee. which I won't go into the details of it, but which includes things like, we are looking at improved access to adequate water of good quality to reduce the drudgery of women and marginalized populations. We want to ensure that there is participation in decision making at all levels that builds on local knowledge that is gained from everyday experiences, developing a human resource policy for water, which includes women from diverse groups as knowledge partners who could be engaged in building watershed, village level data based on women's relation and association with water, where database really emerges from the bottom and could be developed for strengthening both practice and policy. And of course, the gendering of bureaucracy and policymakers. But what we really need is a disaggregated database. We need status reports, situational analysis, and a dedicated research and knowledge building around aspects of gendered dimensions of water. And of course, finally, transformative financing to make all of this possible. But really, what this calls for, this is the wish list we have been talking about for a long time. But I think what we are arguing and what we can see in some of the pictures in the next slide is that this really calls for a transition from a command and control approach to a sharing and caring one. So in such an approach, the women's question and the question of ecological, social, economic sustainability have to be placed at the center of our analysis and politics. So it calls for a different view of an economy and society, new concepts of economics, of work, of employment, labor, productive and reproductive labor. All of these need to be mobilized, and a new kind of an analysis needs to emerge. And it calls for bringing in equitable and life-sustaining forms of resource governance that requires the act of caring, everything that we want to do to ensure that we protect, repair, and heal our world so that we can live in harmony. So while we recognize that there is a need to attend to the macro big picture crisis in the water sector, but we do think that attention needs to be focused on the micro realities that aggravate the bigger crisis. So there is a need for developing relevant conceptual tools to analyze this, and of course actions that are commensurate. So finally, what are the questions that we probably need to ask ourselves? So what would be the new institutional forms for protecting our water resources? Can we learn from our SHGs and other institutional forms where women's collectives have shown the way? How might a feminist understanding of social and ecological reproduction inform our policy and practice in water, inform the design of equitable and ecologically sound water governance? How can technology be developed so that it values knowledge available among people, and also such that its effects could be healed or repaired? And what kind of work are we envisaging? I think that's an important point that feminists have been bringing up all along. That does it challenge the existing power relations? Does it continually call on subsistence and free labor of women and marginalized communities so that commodity and market production is subsidized? Or can we reverse? Yeah, so this is my final point.
Yeah.
That, just to conclude, that just as we don't want polluted waters and dead soil because we know that it will not support our agricultural production, we similarly don't want malnourished women and vulnerable populations, as a result of which we will not be able to sustain our planet. So I think there is a reimagination that is required for groundwater governance. So thank you very much.
Yeah. So thank you so much, Seema, for sharing your ideas, and it was very interesting to know this new approach for command and control to caring and sharing. So thanks a lot for that. And now I will invite Mr. Praharsh Patel. He's a PhD student at Pennsylvania State University, and he will present on behalf of Professor Christopher Scott. So over to you, Praharsh.
Yeah, thanks, Uma, and everyone. It's a great pleasure to meet you all virtually. So I am filling in for Professor Christopher Scott, who could not join today. I will be presenting on his behalf on groundwater governance in energy transition era, especially focusing on water, energy, food nexus reflections. Uh, so evolving for water energy food nexus has mainly two perspectives over here. So first is the groundwater governance tool, using the water energy food nexus as a groundwater governance tool. And the second one is using the nexus as groundwater as an energy transition governance tool. We will discuss about the same in the subsequent slides, but mainly water energy food nexus has a different perspective for the different policymakers, communities, and different people all around. The first one is where we want to see about a groundwater governance tool is like when the entire debate around the water energy food nexus started, it has a prospects of how energy can be provided to the farmers to extract groundwater and how the systems can be worked around. So prospect for high quality power supply to increase agricultural productivity, farmer incomes, and food security was the main focus. What are the main steps around this prospect is like the ration supply to stem power company and utility and also provide access to farmers. Second is like socially progressive subsidies so that the farmers who cannot afford a high energy cost can at least have some access and at least start with something. Uh, the major issue that lies around the geographical targeting to arrest groundwater depletion is also addressed over here. We have known about the dark zones being declared and limited energy access provided to those areas through the power utilities. In this entire perspective, India and Mexico are the high profile cases. And we have seen the case of India where the agrarian economy is very much now fueled by the energy excess and the groundwater excess. Similar cases with the Mexico as well. The Mexico is also highly dependent on the groundwater and energy excess. But what we have from the last 3 decades of experience is that rather than having a progressive subsidies and a more of a robust system around the ration supply, subsidies are being now used as a election sops tool, and it's now become a more of a political economy around the same. One example of how this is being attracted is from the feeder separation in case of Gujarat in India. So feeder separation happened in around 2002-3, and Jyoti Gram scheme was launched. And initially, it was thought it should put some tap on the power supply losses for the utility companies. Subsequently, what happened is like how the expansion of the agriculture and the irrigation happened. The very purpose of like tapping is not very much fulfilled. The increase is evident. Similarly, in case of Mexico, similar to the feeder separation, they started with a nighttime off-peak power dumping. So what that is like it is considered as a wave of future for conventional means the fossil and non-solar energy grid supply for the pumping. What they actually started is from 2003 is like the energy utilities who are under abundance pressure to provide the irrigation energy access. They switched the power to agriculture sector from daytime to the mostly in the nighttime when there is a off peak for the other usage. It was expected that the power dumping during the nighttime will have two purpose. One is like it will not have a negative impact on the other requirements of energy during the daytime, and it will also like nighttime energy is tough to extract, so sometimes farmers will like reduce the consumption at night. But the recent 2017 report has come up with this graph that shows that mostly in most of the locations, the nighttime energy excess is actually increasing, and overall consumption of energy is also skyrocketing in some part of the regions. So there is not a very convincing argument around that this groundwater governance is very much used with the water energy food nexus. Another thing over here is the agriculture, water, energy, food nexus. Who are the winners and the losers in the entire system? So from our experience, we really know that the clear gains are there for the food security and rural livelihoods. Indian economy is now very much dependent on the groundwater sustenance and the many of the agriculture hotspots, including North Indian plains to the Western Indian and Southern Indian parts are very much dependent on groundwater sustainability and also the access to energy to extract them. But what are the unintended consequences around the same? So first is the aquifer conditions and stream captures. The aquifer conditions we have observed is like it has been declining. It's rapidly declining and creating a very FSR development that is untapped. Secondly, rural drinking water supplies are also like unintendedly, consequently affected by the depleting groundwater. And the third and foremost that attaches water with the energy is the carbon emission. So currently, as per the one of the report, there is more than 10% of carbon emission is coming just from the agriculture irrigation supply for energy. But there is a one shining light around the same about the solar irrigation being developed. I think other presenters will be talking more about it, but I would just like to touch upon a few other things that are how groundwater as an energy transition governance tool can be effective from the water energy food nexus. So till now, the groundwater governance is a major focus. Now, there is a shining light if this entire agrarian development and the irrigation development has also something to comment about the energy transition that we are going through from carbon, uh, less carbon emission technologies. So one prospect for an orderly groundwater sector and compliant with power supply imperative and cost recovery is about uh, load shedding and subsidies channeled but not paid by the power sector. It means the federal and state governments are major take up causes of the financial losses for the irrigation energy access. Again, over here, the India and Mexico are very high profile cases where the similar more than 90,000 crore subsidy goes to the irrigation energy access, and much of it goes to the large farmers who use a high amount of water and energy. Also, there is juries out on using water energy food nexus implications of groundwater governance for energy transitions. Firstly, that comes into the picture from the decarbonization has begun, but remains a very distant goal. The decarbonization also has some part to play in water energy food nexus in current scenario. The groundwater cycling and less deep pumping is inevitable. That
actually, my meeting है थी, बोली थी और
Yeah.
अतः प्रवेश पटेल प्रेजेंट करो अमेरिका में.
I said. The major pathways for solar irrigation promotions that are happening now in India has three major components. The first is utility scale grid connected solar pumps. Second is off grid standalone pumps for irrigation. And the third is grid connected farm level pumps. All have a distinct characteristic and different pros and cons. As noted here, the first component has owned by private firms or government utility, and it is produced at a large scale and then distributed to the farmers. Secondly, it's for the farmers without access to reliable source of energy for irrigation purposes, and energy generated can only be used for running their pump sets on field, on their standalone field. It's not connected to grid or cannot be transferred to other places. The third one is the grid connected farm level pumps, a decentralized farm level unit owned by farmers. Energy generated is first used for the irrigation, and surplus energy is also evacuated to grid and has a monetary and larger benefits to the larger communities as well. So briefly talking about advent of solar irrigation in India. So there are a few events that has happened in last very less than a decade or so. So started with 2014 scheme of Surya Raita in Karnataka. Then the EUMIS pilot project on Dundi that started off piloting around grid connected solar pumps. 2016-17, the decentralization of off-grid solar pumps has started, and 17-18 also started with some other models of solar irrigation promotion. One interesting thing around the same is the regions that are also experimenting around the solar irrigation are also regions which are also having the water stress and around great groundwater depletion. For example, the western part of Gujarat and the Rajasthan. Also, Chhattisgarh is till now not a very bad shape, but it's also having a groundwater depletion as one of the issue. Also, the southern peninsular part of Karnataka, Tamil Nadu, Kerala, they all are having a groundwater depletion as a predominant issue. So here the entire debate turns around if the solar irrigation is promoted as a just from the perspective of energy access, there can be a larger negative complications for agriculture as well as the water access, because the groundwater is the major uh, who is taking the biggest shock from this development. Here comes the bigger picture about how the perspectives vary for different people. So the water, energy, and food nexus, although it's very much interlinked and connected, each player in the each sector has a different perspective to look at. For example, farmers in the water, energy, food nexus has focused to fetch water for their crops, whereas the market that actually has to play a bigger role in the food supply and food demand systems. Whereas the utilities and the government are mostly focusing on how the energy can be provided there and what's like how minimal cost and the minimal losses can be incurred in the energy sector that can support the water, energy, food nexus. Here, I just want to quote an example from Kutch region that has a complex case of adversities in the water, energy, food nexus. So the region which is like arid part of India and has a alluvial aquifer system was very much rich in water resources almost like just 2 decades back. But what happened during last 20 years, as already mentioned by Uma in her presentation, that the rapid transition from surface water to groundwater irrigation has caused a huge depletion in the groundwater resources. Like the water level from around 50 meter has gone down to almost 70 meter, and just like less than 10% of total water is extracted is being recharged. So it is a case where there is a depletion of almost 100 meter in like last 10 to 15 years. So also what the consequences for the energy sector comes here is like they have pushed the borewells much deeper. Like the water that used to be around 150 feet now has to be extracted for more than 300, 400, even 500 feet. 6 villages served in the last couple of years by me working as part of UMI and ITP has shown that each village had more than 100 defunct borewells. So there is an energy loss for the constructing of borewell, and also the defunct borewells are there is like newer borewells which are even more deeper and requires much more energy to extract or even mine the water from the deeper aquifers. And mostly the energy is being wasted in a way like if there is 8 hours of power supply, the motor runs for 8 hours, but the water is extracted or yielded just for 3 to 5 hours. Like almost half of the energy is just wasted to create a vacuum for the water level to rise to come up to the surface level. So what happening on the food circle side? So like entire agriculture activities are focused on supplying to the food system and sustaining the agrarian economy. So region also experienced a huge boom in the horticulture.
Raj,
Rob, yeah,
just a quick time check, please.
yeah, sure, got it. This is so the limited consumption of a new produce that are coming up from the horticulture, which had a promising impact, like claim promising effect on the farmer's sustainability or the farmer's economic benefits, is not being realized because market is failing for repeatedly. Like the produce, like the pomegranates or the dates, which are expected to sell at much more prices, almost like 50 to 100 rupees a kg, now being sold into 5 rupees a kg in the market of without a demand. So after all, although the groundwater depletion is there, huge energy is consumed, food is also produced, but still the very big question, like the farmers' livelihood and the status should be increasing, is still a far-fetched reality. And the farmers' condition, even after depleting energy and water resources, is not coming out to be in good shape. So how agriculture and groundwater sector can contribute to this entire energy transition thing? So first is the providing infrastructure and technology. First, these are some new ideas that we can talk about or like can be further discussed during the panel discussion is like the firstly using the agriculture as carbon capture and storage mechanisms. maybe not just in India, this has a larger implications in the other developing and developed countries as well. Also, going from the integrated agriculture and smart agriculture, where water, energy, and food nexuses are like commonly addressed at farm level rather than at policy level. And also underground compressed air energy systems. These are like a new avenues that are being discussed and can be of interest for next few years. Also, the energy economic productivity of water, food and production is also important questions to ask. We have been focusing on more crop per watt or more crop per drop, but it's after all agriculture being an economic activity and also the sustenance of the farmers is an question. Do we need to ask now question like is there a more cash per watt or more than cash per watt drop of water? Also, de-agrarianization of a rural economy is also an important task which can be addressed by recent development of solar, decentralized solar and other avenues, which has a potential to rural industrialization through transition from crop production to the energy production at farm level. With this, I will just end my presentation, and thanks. I just had to fill in for Chris Scott over here, so I hope if there is any question, I would be able to answer.
Thank you so much, Praharsh, for that interesting presentation. And now I will invite Dr. Elena Lopez Gunn, who is founder and director of iCatalyst, a Spanish startup specialized in climate change adaptation and sustainability. So over to you, Professor Dr. Elena Lopez Gunn.
Thank you very much. Okay, I'm just choosing the presentation. Okay, so you can see it now, yeah? Hopefully.
Yes, clear.
Okay.
Just put it on the presentation mode, please. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, that's it. Okay. And hopefully I have a video. We'll see hopefully if I can get the sound to work.
Right.
Okay, so I think I'll kind of look at the topic I was given was looking at the water cycle, hydrology, engineering, and ecosystems, which is quite a strange mix, but I think it's even more interesting when we try to look at it from the perspective of inclusivity. You know, how do you put inclusive governance into hydrology? How do you put inclusive governance into engineering or into ecosystems? So basically, the way I'm going to is going to be like a series of ideas rather than a narrative, where first I'm going to look briefly at the water cycle and its interactions, which I think is going to be critical in the future. And then basically 3 key ideas when I look at, you know, what would I say is really important in hydrology in the future. I will give 2 examples as well as how it can actually be implemented. Then the key idea is when I would actually look at engineering and the fact that they have to deal with wicked problems, and 2 examples of that, how this could also be implemented. And then finally, the key idea of the importance of ecosystems and how we also have to look at socio-ecological systems. And again, giving 2 examples on how we can actually use these approaches into groundwater. Okay, so I think the first thing that I want to say in relation to looking at the water cycle is that in some contexts, and I would actually argue that your country and my country, I live in Spain, entering, I mean, this is something I just invented last night, a kind of like a hyper water scarcity, you know, because we have to really now look at the whole water cycle and its management. What I mean by hyper scarcity is, you know, when we have a confluence of a number of drivers or factors that are really putting pressure on the systems, both social and ecosystems in terms of population growth, climate change, which will gradually get more serious, as Aditi will present briefly. And of course, the fact that because we have mismanaged the resources in the past, and we're still doing so, the kind of water resources that were available since the time of dinosaurs are actually reducing because of pollution or salinization in, for example, coastal aquifers. This means that we have to really consider blue water, rivers and aquifers, but also, of course, green water. You know, how do we manage soil moisture, which I think is really important in terms of, for example, avoiding irrigation. Also, I think it's much more important to also look at the water vapor part of the water cycle, which often is forgotten and yet is critical. For example, when we consider crops and a change of crops, it could actually really affect the kind of ETP budget of that basin. And of course, building on this deep interaction between the land and water in terms of land use change. And this, I think we have to be aware that when we make a decision on land use, it has immediate implications also for groundwater, like for example, aquifer recharge or contamination, or even, for example, for floods and droughts in relation to, for example, soil moisture. So in terms of hydrology, I think the kind of key thing that I really wanted to share with all of you is that we now have to look at, hydrology is a science and the principles are probably the same, but the system has changed, and therefore we have to introduce the concept of adaptive governance. And for example, we have to really look at, concepts like, for example, there's been a series run by FAO, which finished about, I think, 3 weeks ago, on the concept of water tenure, which I particularly like. And there was actually a study done in India. We also did one in Spain, which I really like because it's a much more flexible concept in, reflecting this dynamic relationship that people have with water, where we actually, whereas water rights, I think, are important. I'm not denying they're not important, but I think we will have to look at much more careful micromanagement, where, for example, you might have a water right 1 year and your water right might be different the following year, purely because of wet or dry years, that we have to have this adaptive governance. We also will have to learn to manage extremes, and that means, and in a way, making an opportunity out of a risk, as the Chinese say. So, for example, I think there's been a big project going on in India, actually run by IMI, when you recharge in terms of flash floods to then reuse in terms of water scarcity. We actually have a similar case at the moment in Spain, where we're helping a project which is actually quite curious, of a football stadium that is collecting rainwater, storing it on the ground, and then to be reused during the summer. And then, of course, I would actually say, and this to me is where we come to inclusivity, we need better data, better information, better knowledge, and of course, more wisdom. And that's why I think citizen science and, indigenous and local knowledge is going to be critical, not just scientific knowledge, because we have to have a democratization of science, and inclusivity is also in the scientific world. And I wanted to share 2 examples. This is actually a card deck that we've produced in the context of a project called Groundwater. It's a PRIMA project funded by the European Union for the Mediterranean. And basically what we did with this deck card is the idea that you can both teach users, for farmers, so it could be citizens, about citizen science and their role as scientists, to collect data, but also in a way design your own citizen science project. It's been designed with that idea in mind. Then the other example, which again comes from my home country, because that's really where I do my fieldwork and all my research, is we've actually just a paper that will be coming out soon, where we're trying to develop the concept of co-manage aquifer recharge, where the experience in Spain is that we directly involve groundwater users into the recharging of aquifers, and actually to the point that, where you almost create like a groundwater user community purely for the managed aquifer water. So you then include people into the co-manage aspect of this recharge exercise. Then the second idea is this idea that engineering, I think, is now dealing with very, very complex problems. And then I wanted to kind of go to the roots of the word of engineering. And I quite like it, that is this idea of ingenium, the idea ingenuity, the idea that you want to come up with new ways of doing things. We often now think of engineering as sometimes, kind of rigid infrastructure, but I think we need to go back to the origins of what this science is about, and this kind of whole profession. And it's really much more about solving problems. But I do think that increasingly these problem solving will need to use all the means at their disposal. And this means, again, inclusivity in the sense of engineers working with sociologists, with data scientists, with economists, to ultimately find solutions to what are oftentimes in groundwater very complex problems, or wicked problems even more. Like, for example, the approach that the Dutch are now spearheading about engineering with nature. And then again, an example that I can mention, for example, is this inland lagoon in Spain. It's a very, very complex case. We had a very serious event about 2 years ago, where the lagoon, it was almost like an ecological disaster. And now, as we're trying to find solutions, you can find that they have to consider now a portfolio which includes green, gray, and hybrid solutions. A key element is going to be the sharing of information, so that then there's a visualization of the problems, and that helps to create a common vision for the different actors. And then in this idea of inclusivity is that you have to include the other. And in this case, in Spain, sentence politically is quite difficult, but the reality here is that you have a nexus between land and water governance, where you have the region in charge of land use and the central state in charge of water. So they will have to collaborate. They will have to think of the other if they really want to address this problem. So, and I think, of course, it's important to consider the hard infrastructure, but we should never forget also the soft infrastructure of building up the trust between the different users and the social capital. The other example, which is what I put there because I'd love you if any of the participants wants to participate, we're about to launch probably this week a Delphi survey. It's a foresight technique where we're really going to pull on the knowledge of experts. A number of you are on my list already, on my hit list, where we're going to try and basically have a better understanding on the role of what we call enhanced information systems. What do we mean by that? Well, it's the fact that we have to include users as a very important data point to understand these complex systems. And then the sharing of data, again, which of course is critical for inclusivity, because then it would allow for better decisions. So if you want to participate, then please drop me an email and I will make sure that we put you on the distribution list. It's a relatively long survey, but we of course share the results. And eventually, hopefully, I'll get back to Aquadam when we have the survey results, which will be by October this year. So the third idea is ecosystems and socio-ecological systems as part of, in a way that a kind of inherent part of these ecosystems, and this idea of the natural and social capital as absolutely fundamental element of these socio-ecological systems. I think it's very important that we now understand that healthy, fully functioning ecosystems provide a very valuable range of services for people. And that in a way, aquifers and groundwater are actually critical natural infrastructure and has to be managed as so. So for example, when you're expanding cities, in fact, if you build on recharge areas, well, you're actually damaging, you're building one infrastructure at the cost of damaging another free infrastructure that was there provided by nature. And that will probably come to haunt you eventually, possibly with flood events. Also understand the concept, I like the concept of the ecological debt. I see that a lot in my country, where basically because of poor water governance, you basically abstract more than there is. And, a natural capital accounting at the moment are not really reflecting that you're basically carrying on a debt into the future generations. And I think that also the price signals at the moment do not really reflect the value of society. I wondered recently in the debate in my country at the moment between supply and demand, how is it that desalinated water is the most expensive and groundwater is the cheapest? To me, the price signals are kind of wrong because in a way, you're not considering the opportunity cost if that groundwater is polluted. With desalinated, I mean, the sea is endless. You have energy. Well, we now have solar energy, as we heard before. Groundwater is not, it's not, you can be mining it, but then, it's at the expenses of future generations or the replacement cost. Sometimes you can't even replace it. There's no price to pay to replace it because you can't actually do it. Or the intangible value, like religious value. So, for example, groundwater dependent ecosystems, and therefore you're providing wrong incentives because these price signals are wrong because they don't really reflect the full kind of stack of values. And then I wanted to introduce a concept that we developed in a project we just finished a few months ago called the natural assurance schemes. And here, I'm getting to the end. This is one example, again, of ecosystems where basically here, I think, again, I want to stress the value of information. Here we're collaborating with WWF in Spain to basically, this is one of the national parks in Spain, but it's also one of the most important migratory routes for waterfall going between Europe and Africa. So it's a really important resting site for a lot of species, and it's encroached by illegal groundwater irrigation. And there's trade-offs here, but one of the things that is important is with remote sensing, you're able, we actually trying to get to the point where, in a way, trying to make both uses compatible, but also in a way try to eliminate from the system, behaviors that are really, people that are basically, as I say, kind of passing on a debt onto future generations, and also a kind of ecological debt, for example, for these protected wetlands, and the loss of biodiversity, which again cannot be replaced. And then the last example, and this is going to be my challenge, see
Yeah,
if I can.
this is a quick time check again.
I'm just thinking if I don't know if I.
If it is a short film,
What I want to do is see if I can project the video.
oh,
That was my end, my end, but I don't know if you will see the sound. I don't know. Do you know how to project the sound? You didn't work it out, no? I think.
No, but you can just try. How it's a short film, I believe.
Yeah, it's just literally 2 minutes. So if
Okay,
that,
fine.
it's
Just,
really
we can
short.
try this. Fine.
I'm just thinking, someone told me today from my colleagues that is at the top. You might not hear the sound, which would be a pity, because if you don't hear it, it might not make sense. But anyway.
Yeah, we can hear the sound. So no issues with that. It's audible.
Floods and droughts is increasing, and their impacts will affect both people and nature. Yet one simple solution has always been there, within our reach. The naiads were the nymphs of the rivers, streams and springs, minor goddesses who were our protectors. In Naiad, a Horizon 2020 project, we took inspiration in nature, the symbol of infinity and resilience, to develop what we call natural assurance schemes. These are investments into nature-based solutions for their assurance value. We demonstrated that nature has the capacity to assure our well-being into the future. Nature can help to mitigate current and future climate impacts by recovering natural functions to build resilience to climate change and disasters. Nature can help assure our future. What have we learned? First, a new concept around the assurance value of nature, the protection of ecosystem functions that mitigates impacts while delivering benefits to people and nature. Second, we developed an integrated assessment method that includes a physical assessment of risks, a social assessment to include people in the decision-making, and an economic assessment which gives real quantified value to prevention and avoided costs, as well as a series of tools and methods like new business models, innovative financing, or adaptive planning. Third, we tested all these in 9 real case studies across Europe, from large like the Thames or the Danube to catchments critical to the safety of cities like Montpellier or Ljubljana, or other cities like Copenhagen, Rotterdam, or Łódź in Poland. From rural to urban, from large scale to neighbourhoods, our results show that investing in nature can be more cost effective than investing in grey solutions. And this is particularly important because of the many benefits we derive from nature: safety, health, well-being, and a new way of engaging and being at peace with nature. This is just the beginning. New projects are now starting, like the Horizon 2020 reset on green recovery that continues this legacy. Our recovery and nature's recovery are in fact one and the same. How to use the best environmental intelligence to support new natural assurance schemes through tools like Eco-Actuary, an open access catastrophe model, or sensors in free stations to look at the effectiveness of these nature-based solutions. And most importantly, how we develop real natural assurance schemes projects to help Europe recover while we protect nature and people from climate change. Do join us. The climate is changing.
Sorry. Okay, so I think that was just to on the third idea of ecosystems. I think at least in Europe, as a result of the COVID-19, I think we've really come to understand, the importance of kind of taking care of nature, so that, in a way, is our ally rather than a problem, into the future. And then this is my last slide, just to say that to me, in the future, what we have to think is that we have to consider the whole water cycle and its interactions. That when we're actually looking at hydrology, we have to really include now adaptive governance for non-stationarity hydrological systems. And for us, citizen science and co-management of aquifer recharge, for example, are examples of this adaptive governance. The idea that engineering has to face wicked problems and require ingenuity and the collaboration across sciences and disciplines, like, for example, the land water nexus that I mentioned in the inland lagoon, or foresight techniques that can help us, in a way, tap on the knowledge of experts to not predict the future, but at least understand the possibilities of what could happen in the future and be better prepared. And then, of course, this idea of ecosystems and socio-ecological systems and natural capital accounting. So we actually really understand and incorporate, the value of these ecosystems. And then the example I provided was this natural assurance schemes where we give due value about the protection of these of ecosystems because of the prevention of future damages into the future, for example, for floods and droughts. And with that, thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Lopez. And it was a very interesting presentation. And this idea of ingenuity is really fascinating. Thank you so much for that. And now I will invite Dr. Aditi Mukherjee, who is a principal researcher at International Water Management Institute. So over to you, Aditi.
Okay, I was muted. Thank you so much for inviting me, and all the previous talks were absolutely fascinating. What I'm going to talk about is some of the current studies that are looking at groundwater and what climate change is like. How is climate change affecting groundwater resources? So in brief, I think my takeaway, the main message I want to provide in this presentation is that groundwater, if managed well, will be critical for climate resilient agriculture in the future, but not only climate resilient agriculture, but overall, given how dependent India and a lot of the other countries are on groundwater, perhaps we can also say climate resilience in the future. And in the context of India, certainly managing groundwater will require a energy, water, energy, food nexus perspective, which I was happy that Praharsh has already touched upon earlier. And I think what I should also include here is that a lot of it will also require us to put equity and climate justice at the center of our endeavors. I think reflecting on the talk that Seema gave at the beginning. So my presentation is just a lot of just facts and figures in some ways that's coming from our ongoing assessment. And I know most of you are perhaps already aware of these numbers. Nothing new per se. So first is that while globally we are using only a fraction of the total groundwater recharge, the reality is that like globally it's not a problem. I mean, there's enough groundwater, but groundwater depletion occurs at local to regional scales, and we do know that large parts of India is a hotspot. So another study is showing that human-induced groundwater depletion. So right now, all the depletion that is happening is, I mean, climate change is not really implicated in groundwater depletion story of anywhere. Climate change is implicated in a lot of very important things like extreme weather events that we have been seeing. Climate change is certainly leading to rise in temperature. We are currently almost 1.1 degree high above the long-term, above the pre-industrial times, and that is a lot. I mean, it's like 1.1 degree. It would be like a human body moving around with 100 fever. So that's what. So climate change is happening. Climate change is real, and it is a fact that it's the human-led emissions that is causing climate change. But it's important to understand that when it comes to groundwater, much of the problems we are facing today aren't directly climate change related, though climate change will, like everything else, exacerbate some of the problems through changing the recharge mechanisms, through changes in the rainfall regimes. So what we are seeing is human-induced groundwater depletion at rates exceeding 20 millimeter per year is occurring in some of these major aquifer systems, which are all hotspots. We know High Plains, California, Central Valley, Arabian Aquifer, that's the Middle East and North Africa, Indo-Gangetic Basin, as well as North China Plains. Then I'm kind of, yeah. Okay, when it comes to what we are observing in terms of groundwater and climate change, we are finding that in humid regions, there is a linear association between precipitation and recharge. So basically, all of the recharge is quite straight, is directly related with the amount of rainfall we receive. And therefore, any changes in that rainfall pattern, rainfall intensity would have impacts on future recharge. However, as aridity increases, diffuse or focused recharge dominates, leading to non-linear relationship between precipitation and recharge. And this is also a case where the latest reports are saying is what's happening is intense, like series of episodes of intense rainfall is actually increasing groundwater recharge. And we have evidence from that in India, in USA, and many other more dryland areas. So I think this is something. This is a fairly recent finding about the perspective of diffuse or recharge coming from extreme rainfall events. And as I said, it has been observed that there is episodic recharge happening in India and USA, or higher recharge during more intense rainfall events is likely to make groundwater more resilient to climate change in dryland regions. And I think this is also very, important finding, because we already know for various reasons, groundwater is already a resource that majority of our farmers depend on. It is already more reliable. It's in the individual control. Unlike canal irrigation, where there is very less. Unlike canal irrigation, where there is less control that farmers have. I mean, we already know the reasons why farmers prefer groundwater, and it seems like, especially in arid, semi-arid, dryland regions, if this also continues at a higher level of warming, then episodic recharge will become important. And we already know that extreme rain precipitation events are increasing even in the context of India. So this, you may somehow construe it as a positive part, but the reality is that all of it won't really make so much difference as long as the groundwater extraction keeps increasing the total amount of recharge. And human factors in terms of our pumping decisions remain the main factor for groundwater overexploitation. When we look at the projected values, what we find that a systematic, a meta review, which kind of looked at around 40 modeling studies, all projected, they found that projected changes in groundwater storage due to climate change may lead to a general decrease in recharge in aquifers located in arid, semi-arid, tropics, and humid. So there isn't really much work on what will happen with this episodic recharge, that is higher recharge during high extreme rainfall events into the future. And that doesn't necessarily mean that going into the future that mechanism will fall down. It's just that it's very terribly difficult to model those kind of things into a future climate model. At the same time, some studies are also showing that groundwater recharge is predicted to increase in northwest of India and North China plain. However, large uncertainties remain in these groundwater models. In the context of India, these are some direct quotations from this paper, Ashoka et al., which I thought was a really like a fantastic paper. And there's this entire group in IITM Pune, as well as the group in IIT Gandhinagar, IIT Kharagpur. I think Professor like Vimal Mishra, Professor Ashoka, then Abhijit Mukherjee, they're, I think, doing incredible work trying to unpack what groundwater and climate change, how they're related. And I feel that there's an urgent need for us in the other groundwater community, the groundwater policy researchers and groundwater socioeconomic researchers, to actually work much more closely with them to also understand the physical changes that can happen. And I think the interest is mutual from their side as well. So this paper is saying that groundwater recharge in India in the past is strongly linked with the precipitation characteristics in northwest and north central India, which are dominated by alluvial aquifers. Groundwater recharge is primarily driven by low intensity precipitation. Now, in these parts, perhaps extreme rainfall events would not be all that helpful for recharge. On the other hand, in South India, which is dominated by hard rock aquifers, groundwater recharge is mainly driven by high intensity and total precipitation. Given these, future projections show that in semi-arid India, the projected increase in future rainfall will, I think is a wrong word to use in this context. I mean, projections are always may. So I should say may increase groundwater recharge, though the expected irrigation expansion is likely to negate this positive gain. So the crucial fact remains how much we irrigate with groundwater. Another recent paper by Meha Jain and Ram Fishman and others are actually saying that we might lose up to 20% of our cropping area, especially the rabi cropped area, because of groundwater depletion in certain pockets. Yeah, so that's more or less, but then at the same time, we know of the tremendous role of groundwater in our economy. I will not even read it out because I think this is an audience that is completely aware of the centrality of groundwater in India. What will happen is climate change will increase dependence on groundwater in the future, as it will prove to be more resilient than surface water. I think the surface water, because of its basically slow moving properties and slow response time to climate change. Already our farmers are very dependent on groundwater, and that dependence will not reduce, but instead it will actually increase. And for that, I think we have to really keep focusing on managing groundwater with or without climate change. And we already know that we are seeing unsustainable trends in groundwater use, for instance, since 1970s, thanks to the Green Revolution. We did have positive things in terms of food security, etc. But the negative was also groundwater overexploitation, and Uma had earlier shown us all the maps that we are all very familiar with. So managing groundwater is not going to be easy. It's a work in progress. It will continue to be so, and I think this is something we think that it needs to be managed from all the three sides. There would not be one solution. So we need to do things in the agriculture side, and I see things are being done in agriculture side. Like 20 years ago, when we were talking about it, nobody even was thinking in terms of realigning food procurement policies. Now I see a lot of the procurement is happening from Eastern India or from Chhattisgarh or from some other states, and it's not entirely Punjab and Haryana anymore. Now I see the state governments like Odisha have been providing, and Karnataka have been providing quite good prices for procurement of dryland crops like jawar and bajra. I also see nutrition policies in various state governments are incorporating those low water consuming crops in their midday meal. So I do think that at the end of the day, when water is a constraint, perhaps the only true way, quote unquote, of saving water is to move to lesser water intensive crops in the areas where water is scarce, but you can still grow more water intensive crops in water abundant areas like Eastern India. So realigning where we grow what will be quite important. And in a country like India, you cannot do command and control. You cannot tell farmers you grow this because you don't have water if that crop doesn't pay you much. So policy tinkering in that level to make sure that these dryland crops are also fetching good market prices could be one way of doing that. And I see some of that is happening. Also the huge urban, not the huge urban demand, but upcoming urban demand for more healthier diets is one thing. But I see a lot of possibility in incorporating these kind of dryland crops and low water intensive but nutritious crops in the government programs like the midday meals or the cereals that are given as a part of welfare program. I think that certainly is a bigger market, quote unquote, than some urban, rich, healthy diet kind of a segment. Then we also need to work on this groundwater laws and regulations, supply augmentation to MAR. Elena referred to this EMI's program of underground taming of flood, I think UTFI. So those, I think those.
Sorry.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks.
Yes, and that's then third on the electricity front, where EMI has done a lot of work is around demand side management through how do you ration electricity or metered electricity, and the newest thing is around solar irrigation. So we need water policies to incorporate groundwater explicitly, which we still don't do. We need electricity policies to be very specific about how they impact groundwater, and we need food policies that are actually encouraging low water consuming crops. And the good news is that some of those solutions are happening. For instance, the state of West Bengal has been able to meter agricultural electricity, and we are seeing as a result, there is a huge movement towards diversification, which I personally don't think West Bengal should be the one diversifying. Perhaps Punjab and Haryana should have been diversifying, but we still have a lot of policy paradoxes in our country. So what is happening in West Bengal, because of metered electricity and pretty high electricity rates, farmers are giving up summer paddy cultivation and moving to other low water consuming crops. Then we talked about grid connected solar pumps. That is one quite good way of decarbonizing irrigation, but while at the same time making sure that farmers also have a share in that income. The work that we are doing currently in Gujarat, the evaluation of the Sky project, my colleague Yashoda, who is working on it, she says that she's been finding quite good impact of it in water scarce North Gujarat, where farmers are actually earning 50 to 60,000 rupees a year simply by selling electricity to the grid. And that's quite a substantial income for a farmer to be earning. I talked about solutions in the food sector, which is around higher prices for less water intensive crops like coarse cereals, which are now called nutri cereals, or growing more water intensive crops in water abundant states like Bihar, West Bengal, Assam. These are the states that should become India's cereal crop basket, while much of the more water scarce states should be growing more low water consuming crops. And the solutions in the water sector, implementable groundwater laws, but also other things like demand and supply management, etc. So we have to ultimately look for solutions beyond the water sector, and food and energy sectors are key for groundwater management in South Asia, with or without climate change. So I'll stop there. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Aditi. And we have a couple of questions for you. We'll start with the question from Mr. Amrish Saini, and it's directed to Dr. Aditi. How groundwater recharge in South India is driven by intense and total precipitation? So the question is for you, Dr.
Yeah.
Aditi.
Well, I will be very upfront and say that there would be other people in the audience with much more technical knowledge of recharge who may be better placed to answer that. My understanding is that these are aquifers that get emptied within the first couple of months after, with the intensive water use, they become empty within the first few months after the monsoon, and these are hard rock aquifers which are mostly cracks and fissures. So any extreme water even basically fills up those spaces. But I would really want someone like a hydrogeologist to chip in and answer the question. And you should certainly also, I'll post the link to the paper here for you to read and know more. Though the paper actually doesn't talk about the mechanism of the recharge per se. That paper is based on long-term observation data, and that's their finding.
Yeah, okay. So Dr. Aditi, there is one more question from Dr. Vivek Kade, and he's saying that he's curious to know about the linkage between groundwater and climate change again. And is it irrespective of the aquifer typology, or is this generalization? That is part one of the question. And second one is he's worried about and doubtful about the assumption that high rainfall leads to high recharge. Could you comment on that on the basis of this conclusion?
I do think that a lot of it is very, very context specific, and it's very complex. So I don't think we should go for very large, high level statement. But overall, from various dry tropical countries, it has been seen, it has been observed that high intense rainfall events have led to high recharge. And I'm sure there is somebody within the audience who would also be better placed to talk about it. But you are right. I think that's one of the reasons why we have so few studies that actually looks at the climate change impact on groundwater, because these aquifers are so localized, or even the regional aquifers are so difficult to model. So yes.
Yeah, there is one more question from Mr. Manraj, and
Okay.
the question is about. I was wondering how you think groundwater could feature in a green economic recovery from COVID, especially in the context of the recent farm laws.
Yeah. Well, that's a very good question. And I do think that the work that was started by Dr. Tushar in Gujarat around a small pilot looking at solar irrigation as a remunerative crop. And then the government of Gujarat took up this Sky project, and the evaluation, the ongoing evaluation that's going on actually is throwing up fascinating results. I mean, I was personally, it just seemed too good to be true, but actually farmers are earning quite a bit of money by selling electricity back to the grid. But what is not happening currently is that that is not necessarily leading to lesser water extraction. And the reason for that is the particular scheme of Sky, when it was implemented, it actually upgraded or increased the capacity of all the pumps. So farmers actually got to increase their solar panel capacity and pump capacity, and also hours of electricity increase. So they actually got 40% more allocation of energy. And that's the 40% they're selling back to the grid, back to the government, and earning a fair amount of money. So in this particular context, our preliminary result says that sending electricity back to the grid is not equal to saving, quote unquote, saving groundwater, because farmers got extra energy allocation. But if the scheme could have been designed a bit differently, in the sense that farmers were not given that extra energy allocation, and they had to make a decision between irrigating a plot of land and selling back to the grid, perhaps they would have made those decisions and gone for selling electricity back to the grid. So I do think groundwater can play in that, but there could be lot more options. I'm just talking from one case of which I have some experience. Thank you.
Yeah, and there is one more question, since this is a monsoon period and everywhere there is a lot of floods. So there is a question from Mr. Rajesh Garg. And he says that it is very common for all that's why every year during monsoon, whole country gets waterlogged, and even farmers are scared, even when we have rainfall data for 100 years. So I believe he wants to say that all these projection models are already there, but still we have these floods every year. So what is the solution for that? That is what I'm assuming, looking at his question. So would you like to reflect on
that? Is that also for me?
It's a general question. Anyone from the speakers can respond to
I
that.
just think that the volume, I think India, a country like India always has that flood. I mean, it's just that the volume of rain that falls in the monsoon and the capacity of our rivers to hold on that water. I think flood is a natural, a natural phenomena, and that would continue. But I think the point is not so much the floods are happening, but why are floods turning into disasters? And I think that's where it's basically the human decisions, where we are settling. Many of the floodplains are being encroached. Settlements are coming up in places which were river. So the flood for me is just an hazard, and we have to live with that. The disaster comes from our other socioeconomic decisions, but I'm sure other panelists would also have things to add.
Dr. Elena, would you like to respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I echo what Aditi said. I mean, one of the projects, for example, we're involved in now, where we're working with Cyprus and Greece, which have, like Spain, problems with flash floods. It's actually really to kind of talk about green recovery, literally green recovery, because it's about really recovering a lot of the damaged floodplain. As Aditi said, a lot of floodplains were invaded, and I mean, basically it's guaranteed that you would then have a lot of damages and casualties. So the emphasis now in Europe, and these are projects that are kind of supported at the moment by the European Investment Bank, is really to invest into green infrastructure, not gray. Because also, I think there's more work to be done. We need to know more. But as Aditi said, there's some things that are kind of basic. If you embed the floodplain, I mean, of course, as she says, a hazard turns into a disaster, and that normally is casualties, which can be people and also crops, of course. And when you have population growth, that's or large populations, I think that's an added pressure that then introduces kind of political problems, and tensions.
Right.
I would
Yeah.
like to add something to it. So I have been working on the last 100 years of rainfall data for like last couple of years, and I have a paper on it, working paper on it as well. So what we found basically is like, firstly, the data is also sometimes questionable in statistical terms. But the biggest issue that being observed in recent years is like concentration of rain in very shorter span. Rather than like having a continuous monsoon, what is happening now is like we are having the same amount of rainfall. Rather than in 7 days, we are having it in one day, or even like we have a frequent cloudburst kind of events, not even equally spread. So land use is definitely a reason why the floods are being holding up and why the much of the area getting submerged, but also why the water is coming in a huge chunk in a shorter time. Our systems and infrastructure is not completely planned or adequate accordingly, and this is also a kind of surprise that is happening in last few years. So maybe that is the reason that I see as like a very predominant case in case of the most of the cities in India, that is like the the rain is getting more and more concentrated now in few days.
Yeah. Right. So there is a follow-up question on flooding from Aparna Unni. And she's asking that, and taking up the issue of urban flooding, there is a concept of needing water sensitive cities. How do you visualize incorporating groundwater governance into that particular concept, especially with respect to the urban areas? So any one of you can respond to that.
I just can add a few things. Like there is a huge debate going on around like sponge cities, and there is also infrastructure being developed where there is a huge sponge areas that can hold up the groundwater for the uh, uh, naturally occurring rainfall recharge. But I'm not sure how it specifically works out around India, specifically considering the financial situation of most of the infrastructure development in India, and also overburdened cities and other socioeconomic challenges that India faces. So maybe others can answer it better.
So I think sponsity need not be like an artificial construction. I keep thinking that a city like Kolkata, which is literally surrounded by wetlands on all sides, is a natural spawn city. So many of our cities are Bangalore. These are all spawn cities. So we have actually cities that are spawn cities. What we have done is, encroach those wetlands and places like that. So the spawn city is not about digging wetlands surrounding a city, but is even, I mean, if we can do more stricter zoning regulations, make sure that we are not doing constructions on these surrounding wetlands, and keep room for that water to go. Then it's just possible. It's not as if we need a lot of infrastructure development for that. And there are these urban initiatives now. I mean, Kolkata, for instance, has actually the eastern wetlands that's in the middle of the city. That's been now given I think a UNESCO status, which means urban development cannot happen there. And more and more cities actually need to conserve the existing wetlands that it has within it, and most of our cities actually have.
Yeah, I mean, I would add, for example, I mean, even 10 days ago, we actually had a workshop with a city in Spain, and the whole workshop was about resilience, building resilience. And we had basically one of the things that we were trying to do is map the hotspots where you would have problems. And I think what we're going to see in the future is the confluence of heat waves, floods, droughts, air pollution. And therefore, I think if you have to make cities kind of more more resilient. And for example, one of the things that we were discussing in this context was actually to reconstruct, creating blue infrastructure, green infrastructure, for example, green infrastructure in terms of shade from trees. I mean, you cannot underestimate the cost savings in terms of energy, for example, but also from the point of view of health, for air quality, again, providing barriers for air quality, which is a huge problem, in many of our cities. So I think we have to really, transport, again, is another big issue. But I think the idea, as Aditi said, of sponge cities, I think urban planning is going to be critical, and I think also political will to actually enforce legislation is another element. And I do think also, as I said in our presentation, I mean, I think in India you really do a good job. This idea of including people into the decision making, I think, is also important. But for example, the water company in this city where we had the workshop, they were very willing because, for example, one of the problems they're facing is with the kind of rain that Mr. Patel was saying, you cannot keep enlarging the drains. It's just impossible. The cost is and also the disturbance, to the citizens, you just can't do that. So at one point we were discussing with them, well, wouldn't it make more sense for them to invest, for example, on rainwater harvesting at a large scale, which then provides, for example, green vegetation, in the summer, for example, like by investing in rainwater harvesting in schools, and then you have green cover in the summer when the little ones, for example, are very vulnerable to heat waves. And at the same time, could the water company invest into rainwater harvesting in the schools rather than making the pipes even larger, which are large investments that increasingly, in fact, are not going to work because those events that do not justify such a huge investment, So I think we have to rethink the whole financing as well and how we share the costs. We understand, we project into the future, and then we say, okay, who's going to lose? Can we actually develop a scheme, like what we developed, this idea of the natural assurance schemes, where everyone kind of puts a mutualized scheme where everyone kind of chips in for the overall benefit of everyone. And I think redesigning the cities is going to be a critical element because that's where most people are.
Yeah, thank you so much. Now there is a question for Seema, and it's a very interesting question. Is it possible to look at a possibility of empowering women through self-help groups that provide services around groundwater data for the village or block and work independently or in consonance with water panchayats that may exist? So communities can start seeing the importance of groundwater data as a service from the women to the community. So I think after Seema, even Elena can respond to that because this is what it's all about, knowledge sharing with the communities. Yes, Seema.
Absolutely. So thanks for that question. And I think that's exactly the point that I was trying to make through my presentation, where we are looking at, I also mentioned, the need for a human resource water policy. And this is exactly what, I was trying to hint at. That basically there's this huge knowledge base that is completely either being devalued, not recognized, not heard at all. And, SHGs, of course, have shown the way, but that does not mean that we essentialize SHGs. But I think there are a number of collectives and very interesting new institutional forms that could very well take on some of the issues that you have raised here. And I think, in fact, when, even when we are looking at or what Aditi and every other speaker spoke about, making that shift to less water intensive, moving, to agroecology based agriculture, bringing food and nutrition to the center stage rather than commoditized agriculture. I think in every space of this kind, we will need, the local knowledge and local systems really to participate in a very meaningful and informed way. So very much so. And that is exactly the point that we were trying to make. Like, for example, the state or the National Rural Livelihood Missions, they have brought in a number of these so-called Sakhis. They are village level grassroots workers. But unfortunately, the content that they carry is still very much mainstream. So I think while one looks at forms of institutions and participation, I think we strongly need to advocate, what is that content that we are also talking about? And that's where that shift in how water is used in a sustainable manner and the questions of equity and access become very critical. But very much, yes, I think we need to go beyond just participation into researching, understanding, studying what are these knowledge systems that, could very well be mobilized for an informed participation. Yeah.
I think Uma, you're on mute.
Yeah, sorry for that. So while we will take this last question from Mr. Shashikant Mehtre, And it's about all hydrologic parameter prediction on on histologic data, and future predictions maybe vary, which is not perfect match. Can any innovative approach of future prediction of managed water prices? So basically, I think the question is similar to what if we have some hydrological data, and can we have some innovative approach for future predictions? Any one of you can respond to that.
I mean, one of the examples I mentioned is kind of linked to this, which is the use of Delphi surveys. You know, when you tap into expert knowledge, and it's more like the knowledge you get from experience, really. You know, talking about like Dr. Fima, was saying, you tap into the knowledge that you have from working a long time into something and that almost instinct. But it's a foresight technique. It's not a predictive technique, and I think we're entering into a space, that's what I said about hydrology and adaptive governance, where I think we have to start to accept we will not be able to predict the future. The uncertainties are becoming huge. I think we can see trends, for example, with population growth, etc. And I think that's why it's much more about being better prepared for different scenarios. I think that's much more what I would say is probably the way forward, is to simulate in a way the different options, and then try to prepare yourself for the wider set of options, using a range of techniques, and some which are different, like Delphi survey, for example.
Thanks for that. There are a couple of more questions, but I think we will take those questions towards the end. And now we will move on. Unfortunately, we won't have time to take a short break, and we will continue with this webinar now. And I would like to invite our first panel speaker. He is Mr. KZ Joy, who is a senior fellow at Society for Promoting Participative Ecosystem Management, that is SOPECOM, which is based out of Pune. So over to you, Joy, and please stick with time. I'm sorry we have limited time. So
yeah,
welcome, Joy.
thanks,
Yeah.
Uma and my friends in Aquadam for giving me an opportunity to be part of this very interesting series of webinars on groundwater governance. I've learned a lot. I've been attending all the things, and especially in today's, looking at groundwater inclusion from different lenses. Seema bringing in the whole gender dimension, and also looking at from a more of an intersectionality in terms of also weaving in caste and other type of questions. Even Prakash bringing in this whole question of water, energy, food nexus, which I think also was picked up by Aditi later in her presentation when she talked about or looked at groundwater governance from a climate change, which is, I think, an emerging theme broadly in the water sector, as well as, I think, more closely in the groundwater and things. And I think Elena also looking at from the entire water cycle, much more of an integrated approach. I try to look at. I think all these four, in a way, complement each other to expand the boundaries of, I think, groundwater governance. Probably I'm not going to go into to pick on individual presentations because we may not have that much of time. I think it's 10 minutes that is allotted. Probably I'll try to pick on some of these insights when I'm going to say what I would like to say as part of this. I would also caution you that I'm much more of a generalist in the water sector. The last 30-35 years, what I've been doing is more like a generalist trying to engage with the water issues, especially water justice, equity issues type of thing, or conflicts and things. So my comments, about 3 or 4 comments I would like to share within this limited time, is going to reflect what I've been doing to some extent. So the first issue I would like to pick up is, how do you conceptualize groundwater, or groundwater governance? Is it groundwater a standalone resource, or can we conceptualize that way? Or should we see it as part of an overall integrated water cycle? I think that is the message which I got from Elena's presentation to some extent. I am thankful to her to raise those issues. Though water science tells us that water is an interconnected resource and need to be both governed and managed as such. What we find is that in all spheres of governance, whether it is practice, policy, laws, and institutions, we see that groundwater and surface water are treated pretty separately. And I also broadly agree with the position of Francois Mollet, I think, who spoke in the last webinar, saying that groundwater governance needs to be embedded within the basin management, taking all forms of water together. Only this way, as he said, we can engage with the positive and negative externalities, and also maybe engage with a much larger set of stakeholders in the sector. Otherwise, it can also lead to contestations and conflicts between abstractors of these two forms of water, basically groundwater and surface water within a particular hydrological unit. So this is one message I'd like to give. And we also find that the second connected issue which I like to bring in is in our efforts to convert more and more surface water to groundwater through our own programs, like whether it is watershed development or other water recharging programs and things. We also should realize that we are also changing the property regimes around water. Surface water, by and large, considered in India as a public property resource. I mean, whether that carries out as a public property or a more of a statist conceptualized is a matter of debate. But whereas when it comes to groundwater, it operates like even Aditi paid, it's more of an individual resource or a private resource, or operates under the private property resources. In fact, watershed development studies have brought out this very clearly, that one of the reasons for watershed development programs further accentuating inequities, especially in access to water and things, is because there have been much less sensitivity to this issue of property regime changes, and also very often the unwillingness to craft institutional norms or institutional principles, procedures and processes to offset such issues. So I think it is now time that we move to a more integrated approach, taking a sub-basin or a basin as a unit in which both surface, the soil moisture, as well as the groundwater need to be taken together. We need to generate more and more social experience around such integrated approaches. And I'm happy to report that both the Sopecom and Aquadam is working on a very interesting project in South Maharashtra, where the social movement forced the government to restructure a huge public irrigation system in more equitable and integrated manner. And I'm sure over the next 3-4 years, we may have some more insights to share on this issue. The second point which I'd like to bring in is actually the type of issue which Uma raised. And I mean, how do you make groundwater governance more equitable, much more oriented towards water justice type of issues and things. And here, and this is something which I've been telling, and something new from my side, saying that unless we ground or embed groundwater governance in certain normative concerns and principles, I think probably it is very difficult to address that issue. And I think we also need to build prior agreements and consensus on these normative concerns we have, whether it is equity, whether it is sustainability of groundwater use, or more of participatory or informed choices whether people can make, or other type of concerns we bring in, saying that the whole question of gender, caste, and social inclusion, etc., then I think it's very important to articulate upfront the type of groundwater, the type of normative concerns under which we operate. And I do see that new knowledge and experience also can further in refining such agreements at community levels and things. I'd like to throw up on 2 examples where I would like to illustrate this one. Which I'm quite familiar with, in which people have been able to come to some type of agreement and consensus based on the existing knowledge they have and the type of resource base they have in things. The one is the whole off-quoted example of Hivre Bazaar in Amannagar district, which is a very drought-prone area. And the second is in Nasik district, where there's a public irrigation system which has been remodeled to much more of an integrated system of surface and groundwater through water use association at the institutional base and things. Now, the issue is that in the case of Hivre Bazaar, the context was watershed development, and the issue at hand was how to regulate water use and cropping pattern within the annual recharge. And in the case of Ozer WS, the context was the integrated use of surface and groundwater, and the decision of the WS to use part of their water they receive from the public or the surface irrigation system to fill the check dams they built on the streams crossing the command area, and see how each well owner can be charged. In both the cases, I would say that since this became an important issue, they crafted institutional rules, how to do it, design methods of doing it, methods of measurement and things, and crafted institutional rules. And because of this, we can see that in Hivre Bazaar, whether even in drought years, we can see that they have been able to manage their water use within the annual recharge without much digging into the stocks, which has been accumulated over thousands of years and things. And in Ozar, they have been able to charge the well owners for using the recharge water and things. I think these are very pioneering experience, and how do you learn from these things and things. And the second message from there is that they did not wait for the perfect knowledge or the perfect model to measuring devices to arrive there. With their own existing knowledge, experiential knowledge, they have been able to craft certain institutional rules. And I think there the prior agreement of what they want to do, whether it is in terms of equity, whether in terms of sustainable use, or in terms of pricing mechanisms and things, is an important thing. And there can be many more examples that we can pick up to illustrate this point. The third issue which I would like to bring, because I've been working on conflicts and water-related conflicts for a long time, it is a bit of a pet topic for me. So I thought we also need to look at the groundwater from the lens of competition, contestation, conflicts, and things. Though we all know that there are competition, contestation, conflicts around groundwater, I would say that this has remained a relatively less explored area. The competition conflicts are expressed in many different ways. It ranges from caste violence that public water resource places, whether it is wells or other type of sources where Dalits try to access this water. There have been many violences on them, which is reported, and also to the other extreme of where do the recharge water go? Does that recharge water go to meet the drinking water needs of the people, or does it go to bring more and more land under irrigation? And we also find that the entire caste configuration gets reproduced in terms of the water use prioritization there and map onto the caste inequities in the villages. There are n number of cases, some of which we ourselves have documented, maybe from Gujarat and Maharashtra in one or two of our publications where this type of conflicts are occurring. And very often it is also mapping onto the caste inequities within the village. The Dalits, the women and the landlords very often saying that the recharge water or the increased water should be prioritized or privileged to meet drinking water needs. And the landowning upper caste very often saying that, or capturing this water to increase their irrigated area and things. So this is an area which I think we need much more engagement in this. And also we see that this gets played out even in the interstate water conflicts and things. We know that the way the interstate water dispute tribunals function, groundwater doesn't really actually enter the equation anywhere at all. In fact, the whole fight is about this 15 to 20% of water that is flowing. And we know that if the upstream state actually intensifies watershed development and extract much of this water and use it, that can impact the groundwater flows. So there is a case to say that the groundwater should be accounted in the water sharing, or I would say even going beyond groundwater, probably the total water use or the total water available should be the one which need to be shared. Another dimension which I want to bring in is that I do think that engaging with the groundwater related competition conflicts would also help us to go beyond the biophysical or the techno-managerial approach to groundwater issues, which has been prevalent till today, and get into some of the social side of groundwater governance. I think it's an important thing to this, and this can expand the frontiers of groundwater governance, because conflicts, their resolution or transformation is at the core of water governance. Now, finally, I'll come to my last point, which is my plea saying that if you are to really make groundwater governance inclusive, and this also goes not only for, groundwater, but I think also for generally in water, is that we need to democratize and broaden the social base of our governance institutions. I'm sure many of you would be aware of the slogan, which is now gaining ground again, is that nothing about us without us. I think we should remember this, saying that the people who are going to be impacted, whether they are landless today, whether they are Dalits, they are minorities, women, or landless people, or other type of resource poor sections, need to be involved in this. I think that's the type of plea which I think Seema also was trying to make in her presentation, I also some exchange between Aditi and Seema on the chat box saying that how do you bring intersectionality into groundwater governance, and so I echo that feeling. So the issue is not only about the worldviews of the people who are at the hem of the institutions, which I think Seema, yeah, thanks. I'm just completing it, which Seema hinted at that who is actually there. We all know they are men. They also come from a particular caste and class background. They are also urban in their, where they are residing, and also most probably they'll also come out of elite institutions and things. So these are the people today governing whether it is surface water or groundwater in the country. And also this is not only limited to the institutions at the government level. I mean, if you look at any of the institutions or the knowledge producing or knowledge generating producing institutions today, or even our own NGOs today, most of these institutions are also actually managed, or the people who are there are also broadly belong to this type of thing. So we need to look at much more internally and see that how do you broad base our institutions. In fact, I would say that my own experience is that once we have this diversity amongst our teams, then our conversations change, the questions we ask also change, and the type of knowledge we produce can also be different than what is today. So in fact, I would say that what is out in the society gets reproduced in our institutions. So I suggest a two-pronged approach, or I would say we need to walk on both the legs. One, what we can do within the water spaces that we are part of, and see how do you broad base and democratize those spaces and bring in diversity. And second, we need to get connected with the social movements who are working with these social sections, which are today excluded in things. So I think this relationship needs to be built and nurtured as a first step to make groundwater governance more inclusive. I would stop with once quoting two lines from the English translation of a famous Marathi poem by a famous Dalit poet called Namdev Dasal. And I'm going to quote, "You will draw water upstream and we downstream. You will draw water upstream and we downstream. Bravo, bravo. How do you teach Chadur Varnya even to the water in your sanctified style?" So if you want to really get out of the sanctified discourse around water or groundwater discourse and make its governance more inclusive, then we need to democratize our water-related institutions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joy, for that interesting session. Now I will invite Mr. P. Vijayashankar. He is a co-founder of Samaj Pragati Sahyog, an NGO based in Devas district of Madhya Pradesh. So over to you, Mr. Vijayashankar.
Yeah, thank you, Uma. I'll also follow the strategy of Joy that I don't think we can go into each presentation and go into detail about that. I'll just give an overall view. And first of all, I thank Aquidam colleagues for inviting me again for this conference once again. Nice to hear a lot of things. A lot of ground have been covered in these three webinars. So, Uma, with your permission, can I share screen? I just would like to show two slides.
Yes, of course.
Yeah. So we have talked a lot about the groundwater crisis and the need to manage, etc. My purpose is to just to go back a little bit in history to around 1950 and see what was the situation in India at that time. Is it visible? The map is visible?
Yes, it is.
Yeah, this map is from a book written by Dr. Tomlinson in 2000. It's an economic history of India. This shows the irrigation map of India in the 1950. So as you can see, irrigation in that time, India was very, very limited. Only about 20% of the crop area was irrigation. And most of it was from dams, a little bit from groundwater also, but majority was from dams. And all the shaded portions here are irrigated areas. And you can see the entire landmass of this central and western India, and many parts of South India completely got left out. And similarly, in many other northeastern parts also, many parts of the country are left out. And the places getting irrigation were mostly the areas where water flows by gravity. Like you have these valleys, plains, and river deltas. These were getting, and these were actually historical beneficiaries of the public investment that British government had done. So this was the situation at that time. And now cutting to another 40, 50 years later, you have this map. Yeah, this map, which is prepared by me, colleagues, many of them are here. And you can see here, there's a drastic change. Irrigation access has considerably improved. And all the red patches here that you see are basically groundwater irrigated areas. They generally call it minor irrigation, but most of it is groundwater. So historically, the point I'm trying to make is that groundwater has played historically a very big role in promoting or bringing in inclusion. So when you're talking about inclusive development, the role of groundwater in historically providing access to backward areas, upland, mountainous, and plateaus, which were denied of any access to irrigation, that cannot be ignored. That's the point. One point I would like to make. I'll stop my share here. So this basically means that groundwater has played a very big historical role in inclusion. But that does not mean that the role is present even today. I mean, one webinar we had, one discussion we had, webinar, sorry, it was a seminar. One seminar we had at quite a long ago conference, this issue was discussed, and we, many of us, I mean, Sharath is here, many other people are here, we probably concluded that that phase of groundwater ensuring equity is perhaps over, at least in some parts of India. So we have to come back to the contemporary situation. And there I completely agree with Joy's point that we need to democratize our institutions and democratize the policies and programs the government is implementing. So here I will not talk too many programs. I'll speak about 2 or 3 water-related programs that we are all very familiar with. Integrated Watershed Management Project, which we are also, my organization working in Central India is also the implementing agency. You have NREGA, and very little of groundwater seems to have gone into any of this. The rainfall or the intensity of precipitation has been very high in terms of intellectual precipitation on these programs, but the actual recharge has been very, very low into these programs. These programs are still implemented in a very mechanical way, structure-oriented, and as Joy was saying, none of those principles or norms have really got into these programs. The action has to be at a local level. Groundwater, the major message I think we get from various studies led by Dr. Sushasha and others is very clearly that the groundwater problem may be global, but action has to be local. And local relates to government policies and programs which are being implemented in this way. And there is absolutely very, I would not say totally not there, but very limited awareness of groundwater in those programs. And you have another largest, by far the largest rural development program, which has come up with the Jal Jeevan Mission. And there also, what is the understanding of groundwater there? What's actually happening in our area, I'll give you a small anecdote. In many villages, a lot of pipelines are being laid and the tanks are getting constructed, and there is not filling happening yet. That is a major infrastructure investment which is going on under Jal Jeevan Mission, massive investment. And what's the idea? When the tank is made, after some time, they'll drill a borewell, pick up water and fill up those tanks. So groundwater is centrally figuring in all these programs, whether it is watershed management or NREGA or NRLM that you mentioned, or programs like Jal Jeevan Mission, but very limited thought is given to watershed or Aquifers. Dr. Manshu Kulkarni and his colleagues at Aquadam have propagated this term and taken it way forward. But still, many government policies and programs, this activity, the idea has really not gotten, and that is where I think a lot of action need to be done, and that is where it will actually lead to the kind of inclusion which Seema spoke about, inclusion of women, which Joy spoke about, inclusion of Dalits, backward castes, etc. That happens through government programs at a very local level. Now, the next point, which again I pick up from Aditi's presentation, is that of agricultural water management or an agroecology-based agriculture. As she's saying, procurement in India has been highly biased towards a few crops, which has promoted a very high water-intensive cropping system in the country. 70% of the irrigation water is just used by 3 crops, rice, wheat, and sugarcane. They consume 70% of the total irrigation water in the country. And recently we wrote something, Dr. Meersha and myself wrote something about it it was published in Equitable. When that article came out talking about the kind of diversification that Aditi spoke about, the need to procure, go to other states to increase your, broad base your procurement. The major response, many responses we got, one of the major responses, what will happen to our food security system? If you promote millets and pulses, what is going to happen to our food system? What is going to happen to our PDS? As if the millets and pulses are not food. They are eaten by something else, and only rice and wheat are food. So that food and water nexus is to be very, very centrally addressed. And Aditi is quite right that there is a movement in Odisha, in places like Karnataka, in many other places, and diversification has to happen in Punjab, whether they want it or not. That also should happen, but the pace is extremely slow. And in the meanwhile, groundwater is extremely getting overexploited, and there is very clear evidence of declining levels of groundwater, not only declining levels of water level, or even increasing levels of water extraction. The number of deeper tube wells in the overall MI census data shows the proportion is steadily going up. And the people who are getting affected because of that, people who are getting thrown out of the groundwater irrigation system or any irrigation system for that matter, are typically the kind of vulnerable groups that we just now mentioned, who have been historically included by groundwater, but they are now on the verge of getting thrown out of the system altogether. Therefore, governance is very important there. And since agriculture is the largest user of water, about 90%, if FAO figures are right, gets into agriculture, we need to focus on that and try to manage water there, without which no inclusive groundwater framework is possible in the country. And also, I mentioned mention has also been made about irrigation, food and water, food and power nexus. I will not speak much about that. A lot of discussion already happened. Many of the policies supporting high irrigation or water-intensive cropping systems have a base in government policy, of which power policy is perhaps one of the most important thing. Here again, there's no dearth of ideas. Date Sam, K.R. Date, who is a guru of joy as well as of me, in many ways, he has spoken about volumetric pricing very long ago. But even then, in many states, including parts of including Madhya Pradesh and many other states, the pricing system followed is not something which tries to protect the resource. It's something to encourage the overexploitation of the resource. So there's a need to change that. And coming in a solar may change the whole picture. I'm not very sure about that. As Aditi was saying, the experience of Gujarat is very mixed. So we need to have a lot more things into it. But without these programs and policies getting broad-based or democratized, and democratization of those programs and policies necessarily involve more and more of people's institutions getting it. SAGs were mentioned. There could be many other collectives of poor people. Unless they are strengthened within each of these units, local units, watersheds, river basins, irrigation commands, unless these are stabilized and strengthened, the democratization will not happen. And without that, these principles of equity, etc., inclusion getting actually implemented at a ground level will be very, very difficult. I'll just end by the last with just one thought. I mean, now the point, I mean, you can call it repackaging. The ideas are already there, and those people who should be listening to are not listening. So we have to come up with perhaps some new ways of formulating it. The new way of formulating it could be think of ecosystem as a whole, as something which has to be preserved or maintained, and making that ecosystem as something which has an agency. Agency meaning it's not only for you, it's there. It has its own dynamic, its own linkages, its own relationships. Sustaining that would mean that those people who help support them should be rewarded in some way. I mean, the people who protect water, people who increase recharge, people who use low water requiring crops, people who use less of resources should get rewarded in some way. So can a payment for an ecosystem service, if you see ecosystem as something which is need to be protected, people who are contributing to its protection should be adequately compensated or paid by ecosystem payment for ecosystem services. I'm just wondering, can that be? I'm just wondering, will that be a kind of idea to really push the program, really push the idea of groundwater management or inclusive groundwater governance into all our policies and programs? Can it be the way to do it? I mean, that's a new thought. I mean, not for many of you, at least for me, it is a new thought. So I'll end with that thought and leave it to you for listening. And thank once again Equidam and colleagues for organizing this wonderful webinars. And thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Vijayashankar. And straight away, I will invite Dr. Sharad Lele. Dr. Sharad Lele is a distinguished fellow in environmental policy and research at Ashoka Trust for Research in Ecology and Environment. So over to you, Dr. Lele.
Thank you, Uma, and thanks to Aquadam for inviting me to this very interesting set of webinars. I think in all of the sessions across all the weeks, we have been struggling with the question of time. I hope I'm going to try to keep my comments short, and I'll take advantage of the fact that both Joy and Vijayashankar have covered some of the points that I would have liked to cover. So that's actually an advantage. I can focus on what remains. What I'm going to try to focus on is kind of looking at it from a bird's eye view about how we are using words to convey different things, in our mind, but we think the other person is kind of seeing it somewhat differently. So the title of this whole series, Groundwater Governance, I think itself is a very loaded title. Today's session title of inclusivity is also a very interesting word that has been introduced in a variety of ways. And I just wanted to highlight that when we say these three words or four words, groundwater, governance, groundwater governance, and then inclusivity, we may or may not mean the same thing at all. And I think that's something really important for us to understand. So my first point really is going back to the discussion on day one, which was about management versus governance. I think it is important to understand environmental governance, how we exercise authority over natural resources and natural systems. That is how we make environmental decisions and who makes them. Now, hidden in this definition of environmental governance is the idea that we need to worry about governing about the question of how we make environmental decisions, because there is connectivity. Environmental science tells us there is connectivity within the same generation between different people. So environmental externality in space, in time, or across, for example, human to non-human species. So environmental science, in a sense, is pointing to the limits of resources. And if I consume water that deprives you of water, that means water is a limited resource. And it's through that sense of limits that we're talking about the need for governance. But there is a different sense of governance that prevailed certainly in India in the water sector for in the post-independence era for a good 50 years and perhaps even now, which is a developmental governance, not an environmental governance, which is not talking about limits, which talk about different kind of limits, which is that the resource is unlimited, but people's access to the resource is limited, which is why we need to bring the water to the people, either by building dams or later on by enabling people to drill more wells and pump more water by giving them free electricity. So this is a very different idea of governance, where the state is intervening in favor of developmental goals, not in terms of environmental goals, as in not in terms of seeing the resources limited and therefore requiring regulation. So it's not a regulatory governance or an environmental governance, it's a developmental governance. And neither of these is legitimate or illegitimate. It's the context, as everybody said, maybe a developmental governance was okay in the 50s, but certainly now we need to also worry about the environmental side of it, or the limit side of the story, and how do you operate within a limited resource. My second point is that governance always is for something, not just development or environment, but it is embedded or it is underpinned by a set of normative concerns. And Uma, with your permission, I'm going to share just this one slide where I'm saying that really it depends upon how we frame the idea of why we want to govern. And developmental governance perhaps focuses on the first circle, which is adequacy and affordability for life and livelihood. But then environmental governance focuses on the issue of equity and justice, which is has a whole variety of dimensions embedded within that. It focuses on the question of sustainability, that is intergenerational concerns. It focuses on the question of quality and so pollution and also environmental flows. And finally, I think there is a process dimension to the whole question of do we want the governance to be democratic or not? So depending upon what our normative concerns are, we are going to frame the problem of governance very differently. And I think that's the point that Joy made, but I wanted to reiterate that we need to start with an inclusive, multidimensional idea. Otherwise, somebody is speaking to climate change because the concern is about future resilience, the impact of climate change in the future that will make, let's say, things more unpredictable, and therefore the need for resilience. But at the same time, somebody else is talking about the issue of equity and justice, even in the current way in which water access is distributed, whether it's groundwater or otherwise. So I think we need to have an inclusive, shall I say, to coin a pun, idea of what are the different reasons for which we want to actually try to govern the resource. And this is, I think, really, really important. The third point that I want to make, and we'll stop the share. The third point I want to make is that our ideas of, what is it that we are trying to govern? So we are looking at we are calling it groundwater governance. And I think starting from Francois Moll, and today also, I think this point was made that the interconnection between surface and groundwater cannot be ignored anymore. And we need to stop thinking in terms of groundwater as only a common pool resource from which different people are pumping, and it's being driven down and therefore kind of being exhausted. And so the concern is either of inefficiency, because at a lower groundwater level, you have to put in more energy to pump the same amount of water, or it is a concern of unsustainability, which is reducing access to future generations if we kind of run out of water, which if we were to run out of water, then anyway, that's because it's a non-renewable resource. So we were always going to run out of it. But really, the connectivity between surface and groundwater means that should be talking about water governance. So stop talking about groundwater governance. Let's talk about water governance. I noticed that Joy started with that point and then slipped back into the question of groundwater governance. So I just want to emphasize that the framing matters, and here we need to be talking about water governance as a whole. My third point is that the word inclusiveness or non-inclusiveness, I got a really array of meanings today when we talked about that. So Seema emphasized the gender dimension. In the chat during Seema's presentation, there was also the comment about caste and class, of course. Vijay gave it a very different twist by saying areas that are dry, rain-fed areas are left out of the developmental process, and in that sense, they are being excluded from the developmental process, which I thought was a very interesting or intriguing way of talking about exclusion. Because my understanding of exclusion was more in the context of where you have a resource, but within a particular community that has access to that resource, some people are given access and others are not given access. So, for example, landless people are completely left out in any discussion about water rights. Big farmers have more access because they have the money to, for example, keep drilling more bore wells or deeper bore wells. The point that Joy made about upstream recharge leads to downstream benefits for well owners. And the larger point about the upstream depletion of groundwater depletion, leading to loss of base flows in rivers and therefore depriving downstream users of water. So inclusiveness or non-inclusiveness has many dimensions. I think in the context of water as a whole, the intergenerational dimension has been emphasized a lot when we talk about sustainable groundwater use, but really the intragenerational, whether it's upstream, downstream, or within a locality, the intragenerational exclusion dimension is probably the biggest. There's a gender angle, caste angle, class angle, which are the social dimensions overlaid on the biophysical reasons for exclusion. That is the upstream, downstream, or unidirectional externality. So again, moving from a common pool framing to a framing which is about a resource that is a moving resource and therefore has a constant unidirectional externality over and above the possibility of it being locally common pool. I think we need that more complex notion of the resource rather than only saying groundwater and only saying common pool resources. I think we need that broader framing to sort of inform our notion of governance. My final point is that if I remember Aditi had a very nice slide of the three aspects that need attention and that are getting attention in the Indian context: the electricity dimensions, which is sort of outside the water sector, the food dimension, which is also notionally outside the water sector, both of which provide entry points or leverage points to make an impact on, for example, the issue of groundwater depletion. And the third point she had, of course, was in the water sector itself, the implementable groundwater laws was the point that she put in very brief. And I think throughout the last 3 days, the 3 weeks or 3 rounds of this conference, we have relatively de-emphasized or paid less attention to this question, that apart from Tushar saying that it is basically not possible. So on I think on day one, Tushar pointed out that we have tried in a variety of ways, passed a variety of laws, and Tushar has basically thrown up his hand saying it's not possible to regulate groundwater use. Now, how much of it is because of Tushar's normative concerns being different, I do not know. But I think we haven't really explored that question well enough, We have assumed that certain laws have not worked, therefore all laws will not work. If you look at we need to go beyond laws and look at the investments that we have made in this sector of, in terms of the institutions, whether it's knowledge institutions that focus on where to find water rather than telling you how much water we have and how its use will affect somebody else, or the administrative institutions where you've got 30 groundwater staff, 30 staff in the Groundwater Directorate of Karnataka, which is one of the most, thank you, Uma, which is one of the most groundwater intensive states in the country. We've got 30 people in the Groundwater Directorate of Karnataka state. So complete underinvestment in, whereas you have 5,000 engineers, 5,000 staff in the surface water department, the irrigation department, right? So look at the contrast. Again, that's developmental governance for you and a complete neglect of the environmental governance. So I think we have not framed good laws. We have not given them either the financial or the administrative or the knowledge backing that is required to implement them on the ground, including, of course, the fundamental point about participatory bottom-up governance. But I'd like to extend that by saying, while in a small community amongst us, we talk about participatory groundwater management, when it comes to water governance, we'll have to nest that within the basin context that Joy also mentioned, because of the surface water groundwater connectivity. So you need a more democratic water regulatory authority at the basin level that is allocating resources, maybe at a watershed level or a micro watershed level, where you talk about participatory management of that allocated resource. So I'd like to end there by saying that this aspect, the question of institutions for groundwater governance, while not at all de-emphasizing the cross-sectoral implications of electricity and food, I think we should also pay a lot of attention to the question of how we can rethink the legal and administrative side of groundwater regulation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lele. And we are coming towards the end of this webinar. And now I would like to invite Mr. Shilp Verma. He is a senior researcher working on water, energy, food processes with International Water Management Institute, IWMI. Over to you, Mr. Verma.
Thank you, Uma. I hope you can hear me well. It's very difficult to follow the three speakers who've just spoken before me. But when I thought of what I want to say today, and that was even before I heard the presentations, I thought that I'll start by talking about how the equity or inclusiveness of groundwater governance has multiple dimensions. And I'm really glad that the way this webinar has been organized has already touched on several of them. And wherever there were some aspects missed, I think Joy did a fabulous job of highlighting them. So I'm not going to talk about all of them, but I'm going to focus on one which was also discussed by two of the speakers. And I really think that some of the work that IWMI has been doing in India, especially the work that we did as part of the IWMI Tata program, which has already been discussed, has focused on looking at how energy policies have actually created a lot of the consequences for the groundwater sector and the water sector in general. Actually, in much of our work, we found that energy policies have a much bigger impact on groundwater than water policy itself. And within that, I'm going to specifically talk about the potential of solar irrigation, which is growing very fast in India and also elsewhere, on how it can, it can have both kinds of consequences. It can actually make the equity and inclusiveness worse. It can lead to a more deteriorated situation, but it can also, if it is promoted well, it can also lead to positive equity outcomes. So I'm just going to focus on that one aspect. I think all the other topics are already well covered. Now, we've seen that if we compare Eastern India, which has relatively better natural water endowment, and also Central Tribal India, these areas, farmers just don't have access to subsidized electricity, which is available for free for farmers in Punjab and Haryana, and at highly subsidized rate throughout Western and Peninsular India. So that is also one dimension of inequity that we have discussed. So where water is naturally scarce, there farmers actually face no water scarcity because they have free power and subsidies to keep deepening their tube wells, and they keep extracting groundwater. And on the other hand, where groundwater is relatively abundant, there farmers tend to economize on their irrigation because they're forced to use expensive and polluting diesel. So I'm going to talk about how solar irrigation can play a role in both these two different contexts. In Eastern India and in Central Tribal India, I think that solar irrigation or solar powered irrigation using surface water as well as groundwater can actually hugely improve access to affordable energy. I mean, the demand for energy in all these areas is not, no farmer wants to use energy itself. Even the demand for water is a derived demand. Farmers want to use the water to grow a crop and to earn an income. All this demand is actually for income. And actually, I think that solar irrigation can improve the income, especially for small and marginal farmers, by replacing expensive and highly polluting diesel pumps with solar pumps in these areas. That is one major aspect of what solar irrigation can do, and we will need to make sure there could still be an equitable distribution of this new technology. Like any new technology, including tube wells itself, there is a possibility that this technology will only end up in the hands of a few elite farmers, and we have to make sure that access to the benefits of solar irrigation reach the small and marginal farmers and the tribal farmers who have so far lacked this access. Similarly, in Western and Peninsular India, where actually the energy subsidies and the fertilizer subsidies and the MSPs have actually led to severe negative consequences for groundwater, there solar can play a very different role. Again, by converting electric pumps to solar pumps, one immediate impact will be that the huge amount of money that the government of India and the state government spends on subsidizing farm power. I think at last count, it's somewhere around 90 to 100,000 crore every year, or about 15 billion US dollars every year we are spending. And that's actually, well, in a way, it is supporting livelihoods, but it's also a big waste because it's actually creating perverse incentives for people to misuse groundwater. And if we can reduce that subsidy by solarizing these tube wells, then that would be an immediate impact, positive impact on the groundwater economy. Of course, the second impact would be that we will reduce the carbon footprint of groundwater irrigation by replacing the highly sooty grid power with clean energy. But the third and fourth impacts are actually, they can be even more significant. One is that if we are able to make sure that farmers not only produce this energy on their farms for pumping groundwater or pumping water in general, but they can also use some of that power to sell it back to the grid or sell it eventually also maybe in the future to industrial users and basically become independent power producers. Then instead of using subsidized energy to pump groundwater to grow crops which can then be sold at MSP and earn an income through this very convoluted way, this itself can be a source of income for the farmers. And if that happens, then probably that could be one way of reducing the livelihood pressure on groundwater and on the exchequer. Solar energy is going to be produced. I think that we as a country have very ambitious targets of increasing our solar generation capacity. The only question is that whether we are going to produce all of it in large ultra megawatt scale solar plants, or we can produce some of it through farmers who can use the power of the sun to generate income directly, and in the process also reduce the pressure on groundwater and help improve groundwater governance. So that's that's my submission. I think that there are ways to make sure that this transition that we are going to make from diesel or grid connected irrigation pumps to eventually solar pumps. There is huge potential. We have our current pumping capacity is about somewhere between 120 to 150 gigawatt. That alone can be 1/3 of our renewable energy target. So that is huge potential. But if it can be done in a way that is also able to create positive externalities for the groundwater sector, then I think it will be a much better way of making this transition. I think that's also the point that Chris and Praharsh were trying to make, and I think Aditi also spoke about it. There is a lot that is happening in this space, not only in Gujarat, which actually got inspired by EMI's pilot and have introduced this Sky scheme, but almost every state has a solar irrigation policy. Some are grid connected, some are off grid, some are creating decentralized solar plants like in Maharashtra. And each of them, no one model will fit our very wide and very different contexts present all over the country. And I think that we need to look at each of them very carefully and make sure that as we make this transition, we also avoid increasing the problems of groundwater governance and actually use this transition to make groundwater governance easier, but also more equitable, and make sure that the benefits of this new technology can be transferred to the small and marginal farmers in the country. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Shilp. And we really had a very interesting and stimulating discussion on this topic today. And we all had so much to say on this topic of inclusiveness that we really ran short of time. But before I hand it over to Dr. Himanshu Kulkarni for his concluding remarks, we will take a question. And there is a question from an anonymous attendee. The question is for KZ Joy or Mr. P.S. Vijayashankar. It says that shouldn't the narrative now change from farmers' needs to diversify, become more water efficient, to how to enable them to do so? Like farmers in Punjab, for example, want to change, but the existing system won't allow them to do so. Similarly with sugarcane, especially in Maharashtra. So first, Mr. Joy, and then Mr. Vijayashankar.
I mean, very briefly, I think Viju can pick it up more in a detailed manner depending on the time available. I would say it's not a question of one or the other, whether it's a question of diversify or shifting that to water saving. I think both are much more interrelated. In fact, why you are asking or arguing for crop diversification to what Aditi or later Viju was saying, to less water consuming crops and type of thing, is that it's also with the idea of saving water. See, water saving is not only through drips and other type of things. There are a whole lot of agronomical practices, including cropping pattern shifts, which are required to water saving. There are, even sugarcane in Maharashtra, why farmers grow sugarcane even in drought-prone regions is a question that is this. And very often people with just urban sensibilities look at this issue and saying that, oh, farmers don't care for scarce water and type of thing. But I don't think that's the issue. Even the toiling farmers today, if you look at the whole the land holding of average farmer who is a member of a sugar cooperative, there are 1 acre and 2 acre farmers who are who are cultivating sugarcane. Why do they do it? So there are a whole lot of political economic questions which are related to it. We need to address them, and including restructuring water system. Today in Maharashtra, the public irrigation systems cannot provide water maybe once in, they may be provided once in 3 weeks or 4 weeks. And except maybe sugarcane, even if the gaps between two rotations increase, sugarcane doesn't die. Your tonnage might come down a little bit. But if a farmer needs to diversify into, let's say, horticulture crops or like vegetable crops and things, much more sensitive, which needs high frequent but less water type of a thing. So our system should be able to deliver this if you are to really make a shift. But for me, the important question is what happens to saved water? Does the water get saved actually through all this type of thing? My experience and various studies shows that water really doesn't get saved, even at a basin scale. And also we need to ask the question, where does the saved water go? Does that go back into the ecosystem as better flows? Or does the saved water become pooled together and create better equity or access to people who don't have today? I think these questions are not asked. I think we need to shift our discourse to, what happens to the saved water. I think for me that is more important. Yeah, Viju.
Yeah, thanks. I think that's a very interesting question, very good question, because many things, I mean, we tend to blame farmers in Punjab and Haryana for overexploiting groundwater, but we must also realize, as you rightly point out, that this has been created by a system. In 1960s, when India was intentionally short of food, we asked Punjab farmers, we went to the country, India asked Punjab farmers to produce more food. And that's where more subsidies, more everything was extended to them. And they have got on to that, track. And it's basically, they have been producing food for the rest of the country, and that has been feeding including our PDS and all that, many things have been done on that. So there's can be absolutely no blaming the farmer. The farmers are right now caught in a certain situation, and that they need to move out of that. We even blame farmers for burning, stubble burning. But somebody recently pointed out that in the 1970s or 80s, stubble burning was part of the agricultural package of practices recommended to farmers. After harvest, you burn your stubble and then get on to the next crop. So all these habits have been taught to farmers by agriculture scientists or our governing institutions or something. So they need to change all that, and creative and alternative options need to be worked out for them. And that is where I think we should focus on. And I would completely agree that enabling framework is what is required, not blaming this one or that one. And I would also add that what Punjab is going through, something very similar. Many parts of Madhya Pradesh, where I stay, western part of Madhya Pradesh is going through the same thing. Madhya Pradesh was not growing soybean. 1917, 80, between the late 70s, early 80s, soybean was introduced. Farmers were heavily encouraged to go into soybean. Now soybean is a universal crop. There, what 30% or something of the crop areas under soybean, and it's undergoing a lot of problems. And many farmers, I know, we work with farmers. Many farmers we work with want to move out of soybean, but there are no options available. And soybean, the issue is not about water and all, there are many other issues. But whatever it is, the point is that options, unless they are developed, and that devolves upon the state and the agricultural research institutions, to agricultural research system, to work out creative possible options for farmers so that they can move out. In Punjab, many people who I know who work with Punjab farmers closely say that they want to move out. They are open to a different kind of situation. But unfortunately, the enabling circumstance was not there. I think that I cannot say much about Maharashtra, but definitely in Punjab, I think the statement must definitely hold. Thank you for that correction.
Dr. Lele, would you like to add?
No, I just wanted to add, because I think the question was how, saying if we accept that farmers need to switch to diverse and water efficient cropping systems, how would you enable that? And I don't think I have any wonderful answers, but it did seem to me that there's a link here with the idea of inclusiveness, in the sense that when we say farmers need to shift, it's not that all the farmers in a village or all the people in the village, if you count the landless and the agricultural laborers, are all enjoying the benefits of water intensive crops, single crops kind of systems. It is a subset of the farmers that are enjoying that benefit. So the idea of inclusiveness, if you say that there is a limited water resource that needs to be shared more equitably than it is, I think unless not unless, but certainly if we can inject this conversation, this dimension into the conversation, we might be able to force a bit of a transition. So Vijay Vijayashankar pointed about the sort of, not blaming the farmers, enabling them to do it. But I think part of that is also about the discourse, what equitable sharing of a limited resource. I think that has pretty much fallen off the map. It's all about the farmer is either a victim or the farmer is, the farmer is a homogeneous category, either as a victim or as a curse, rather than a much more nuanced understanding of the village context. So I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, thank you. Mr. Verma, would you like to reflect on that?
No, I actually think that one easy way for convincing farmers in Punjab to diversify away from rice and paddy could be to just ask them to grow solar energy. After all, they don't want to grow paddy. They don't even eat paddy. They want income. And if they can earn income by selling power, then why not?
Right, that's interesting. Yeah. So we are really running short of time. And now I will invite Dr. Himanshu Kulkarni to give his concluding remarks. So over to you, sir.
Yeah, I mean, it's not concluding remarks. Honestly, I think learned a lot. I was taking notes. It's just too late in the morning, too late in the afternoon, and too late in the evening to go through them. But I'd like to just come back, to some of you with specific questions that I have. I mean, one of them, of course, was this carbon capture and groundwater that came up earlier. And maybe a quick round, almost like a concluding set of statements from the panelists. Maybe a one-line, two-line statements from the panelists on that, because there was a lot of discussion going around carbon capture and groundwater, especially after Praharsh's presentation. And I'd certainly like to hear from Sharad and Shilp, and also from Joy and Viju, because I think we talked a lot about climate change. Elena's presentation also talked a lot about building resilience. So from the panelists' point of view, if we can have a common set of responses to one question, which is this whole question of carbon capture and groundwater, which has to do with groundwater and climate in some ways, I'd be very happy. Sharad, maybe you can start. You can start. If you...
Sorry, Himanshu, I have absolutely no idea what people are talking about. But from a very superficial check, I don't think this is a big, big thing that we should be focusing on at all.
Okay, fair enough. Shilp?
Yeah, I'm afraid I also have very little knowledge of this. I'll need to study it more before I can comment. Maybe Praharsh can actually enlighten us before we talk about it.
Joy? You're on mute. You're on mute.
Yeah. No. Himanshu, I mean, I agree with I think probably we should hold this question for another webinar where we come a little more prepared, I think, try to understand. I mean, seriously, because there's no question of just commenting anything which is going deeper into it.
I also have absolutely no idea.
It's an important issue. So probably Aquadam should organize another webinar soon. Yes.
Or you ask some of the speakers.
Yeah, yes.
Maybe the speakers are better than us
to.
Yeah. So maybe I'll sort of toss it back to Praharsh if he's around, if he wants to make a quick statement. I think he clarified it in his response. But Praharsh, very quickly.
Yeah, sure, Himanshu. So certainly this is the point that Chris Scott came up with, and mainly his idea was also that there should be a discussion around this. If there is anything important or like something that is new for most of us in India, mainly who are focusing on groundwater from different perspective. So certainly this is something which we really like to toss and see like how the response is coming in and how the people are thinking around the same. So currently, I will also accept the same reply that I don't know exact the answer or any specific thing, but there is no at least harm in exploring this idea as well, rather than straight away rejecting it.
Okay.
Yeah, next webinar, Himanshu, I think it's subject for the next webinar. We should do it.
We probably should have one on that. So
and invite some external experts, not people out here.
So just let me, since I've also given the floor to Praharsh for a minute, let me give the floor to Elena and Seema to maybe make a quick closing comment.
Yeah, I think, I would encourage you to have the seminar. I think it's interesting, but I think I would not lose sight that the challenge in groundwater is not carbon capture. It really isn't. I think for me, we have to build resilience in the system. We have a climate that is changing, and the system is already really stressed. And I actually share what Dr. Joy was saying to me. People is the answer. We have to really include people. We have, there's no way around it. We cannot rush forward and now there's a new solution. No. The solution is very simple. We're taking too much water. We have to find ways of taking less water, leaving more in the system, and making whatever benefits come up from water benefit more people. So I think otherwise we're just deluding ourselves, I think.
Yeah. Thank you.
Sorry.
Thanks. Seema,
I believe in people. I think we can do a lot, but I think, I think we have to trust in people and include them because it's their lives in the lifeline. So.
Would you like to?
Well, I think I've said enough, and everyone has said enough. But I think clearly what has emerged from today's discussion is that we really need to reimagine governance and have an expanded understanding of governance. And when we look at water, I think we also need to look at the broader fields outside of water as well. So agriculture, yes, a very significant part of groundwater governance. I think it's more about how we imagine that development paradigm, the agrarian paradigm, which in fact will create spaces for making it more inclusive. So I think that's where I would like to close.
Thank you, Seema. So we'll close there. I'll just
I think, Ivanshu, I would like to just add that a lot of things which have been raised are topics for further discussion. For example, how do you get these ideas into programs? You talked about procurement, you talked about recharge, you talked about people talked about people institutions. Specifically in the context of a watershed program or an NREGA or any other rural development program, how do we actually get this thing into those programs? I mean, we have been trying for a very long time, as I mentioned. So how do we creatively do that, and what is the level at which it can be pitched? I think this can be a topic for detailed discussions later. Yeah.
Sure. Thanks, Viju. So I first of all, thank you everyone for staying back. And I want to actually close with three or four things that I learned in this particular session. And one of the big eye openers was intersectionality in inclusiveness. And I think that's a new one. And I think it's important for us to really look at the microcosm of inclusiveness itself through the lens of intersectionality. Many dimensions, Sharad mentioned it, governance, ecosystems, and also inclusiveness, that in trying to pursue inclusiveness, let's not lose sight of certain areas which might get excluded. And therefore, I'd like to also bring up, in the lighter sense, one example. In the course of today's discussion, we didn't have a specific reference to people who depend on spring water. And I want to bring this up specifically because, again, within groundwater, when we talk so much about the crisis in India, it's really a crisis that is, it's a man-made crisis in some ways. We talk about bore wells and tube wells and energy, and everything we talk about is essential and an externality when we look at groundwater through an ecosystem lens. And we know communities, we work with communities who depend on spring water. Everything is spring water. So there's no energy there. There's absolutely nothing but, they are essentially tapping water through the ecosystem window. And interestingly, in this entire conversation, I found that one element to be completely excluded. So I'd like to end on a positive note, that these are the kinds of elements, and like many of you said, highlighted many other factors. I think we need to bring these elements to the fore. So let's see how we can do it together, maybe a set of discussions on these specific topics. So thank you once again, and hopefully you will join us for the last webinar of the series, which is next Tuesday, when we want to round this up. Thank you so much.